Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the house, her hand resting on the cool brass knob, eyes scanning the room. The air inside smelled faintly of dust and something old, like a forgotten attic. The house was quiet, too quiet for a place that had just been purchased, freshly lived in. Her heart raced with a mixture of excitement and unease. The house was far from perfect, with creaky wooden floors and a few rooms that had seen better days. But there was something about it. A charm, a promise of something new. Behind her, James shuffled into the entryway, lugging boxes from the car, his face filled with an optimistic grin. He always had that grin when things were new, when they were beginning again. "Do you think this place is going to feel like home?" Evelyn asked, her voice uncertain, though she wasn't sure if she was asking him or herself. "Of course," James replied, setting a box down on the floor. "It'll take a little getting used to, but it'll feel like home soon enough. And think about the price. We got it for practically nothing." She smiled, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. Practically nothing. The price had been suspiciously low for a house of this size, but she pushed the thought aside. The realtor had mentioned something about the house's history, something vague about it being abandoned for many years and the previous owners having left in a hurry. Nothing serious, nothing worth worrying about. She looked at James again. His hopeful expression was all she needed. They could make it work. They always did. James stepped past her into the living room, then froze. His eyes narrowed as he looked toward the far wall. "Evelyn, do you hear that?" She paused, straining to listen. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves outside the windows. But then, just as James had said, she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to emanate from the walls. A quiet, mournful wail, like someone crying in the distance. It was not a sharp sob or a scream, but a slow, deep sound of sorrow, almost as if the house itself was grieving. Evelyn's blood ran cold. She turned quickly to face James, who was already looking at her with wide eyes. "Is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," James replied, his voice thick with unease. "It sounded like weeping, but where's it coming from?" They both stood in silence for a few moments, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The house returned to its quiet, empty state, the kind of silence that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. "It's probably just the house settling," Evelyn said, forcing a laugh to break the tension. "It's old after all. Things creak. We'll get used to it." James nodded, though his face was pale. "Right, yeah. Just don't know if I'm ready to get used to it." Evelyn put a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer reassurance. "Let's just get everything unpacked and then go to bed early. I think we both need it." The evening passed slowly, the house seeming to grow darker and colder the longer they stayed. They worked together in silence, unpacking boxes and trying to make the rooms feel a little less alien. The weeping sound didn't return, but there was a strange heaviness in the air, a feeling that something unseen was watching them. By the time the last box was unpacked and the house felt more familiar, the sun had set and the room was bathed in the dim light of a single lamp. Evelyn and James sat on the couch, their shoulders touching. Exhaustion weighed heavily on their bodies, and they both knew that sleep was just a few minutes away. Evelyn glanced at the clock. "We should probably get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be busy." James nodded. "Yeah, you're right." He yawned and stretched, then stood up, heading toward the hallway. "I'll get ready for bed. You good?" Evelyn smiled softly at him. "Yeah, just give me a minute. I'll be right there." As James disappeared into the bedroom, Evelyn sat for a moment longer, her eyes scanning the room. She felt a growing unease, an almost imperceptible prickling at the back of her neck. It wasn't fear exactly, but something like it. The air felt too still, as though the house was holding its breath. Suddenly, she heard it again, the soft weeping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was closer. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was no longer faint. It was louder, more distinct. It came from somewhere within the house itself, almost as though the house was crying. She stood up, her heart pounding, and slowly began to walk toward the source. Each step felt heavier than the last, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The sound was coming from the hallway, a room at the end of the hall. With trembling hands, she reached for the door. It was ajar and pushed it open slowly. The room inside was dim, bathed in shadow, the only light from the moon spilling through the cracks in the curtains. The weeping was louder now, so close, but there was no one in the room. Evelyn took another step forward, her pulse quickening, her eyes scanning every corner. The walls, they seemed to be crying. Dark streaks of moisture had appeared on the plaster, running down like tears. The sound was clearer now, definitely coming from the walls themselves. A quiet, mournful sob that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the house's breath. She reached out, a trembling hand to touch the wall, but just as her fingers brushed against the cold surface, the weeping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn pulled her hand back and backed away, her breath ragged. The room suddenly felt too tight, too alive with an unseen presence. She turned quickly and ran back down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the dark. When she reached the living room, she found James standing in the doorway of their bedroom, eyes wide with concern. "Evelyn, what's wrong?" She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She could only shake her head, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. James stepped closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "What happened?" I heard it again. The crying, she whispered. "It's coming from the walls, James. It's real." James frowned, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "It's just the house. It's old. We're just tired." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "It's not just the house. Something is wrong with this place." James glanced toward the hallway, a nervous glance that didn't escape Evelyn's notice. "I'll check it out," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though his voice was strained. But Evelyn stopped him. "No," she whispered urgently. "Don't. Please don't go down there." James hesitated, and for the first time, Evelyn saw fear in his eyes too. But then, with a sigh, he pulled her gently toward the bedroom. "We'll figure out tomorrow," he said softly. "For tonight, let's just sleep." But as he closed the bedroom door behind them, Evelyn's eyes darted to the shadows outside the window. Somewhere, in the deep recesses of the house, the weeping had begun again. And it was louder this time. Closer. Too close. Evelyn couldn't sleep. The weeping continued to echo in her mind, as though the house itself were speaking to her, calling her in her dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw shadows shifting in the corners of the room, and every whisper of the wind made her body tense. The sheets were tangled around her, a cold sweat forming on her skin. She glanced over at James, who had fallen into a deep sleep, his face relaxed in the way it always was when he was at ease. But Evelyn couldn't share that peace. The house had unsettled something deep within her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily, the rhythmic sound almost soothing in its regularity. But in the silence of the house, it seemed to echo louder than ever. Click! Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The sound was faint, barely audible, but it came from the hallway, just beyond the bedroom door. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving in the dark. She held her breath, straining to listen. The weeping had stopped for the moment, but her senses were sharp, alert. She heard it again, the soft scuff of footsteps. No one else was supposed to be here. She slowly turned to look at James, who still lay unaware beside her, his breathing slow and steady. Evelyn quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. Her feet touched the cold floor, and she froze, her ears straining to hear any more sounds from the hallway. But the house was still, too still. The wind outside had picked up, and a faint creak sounded from somewhere deep within the walls. She reached for the lamp on the nightstand, turning it off to avoid casting any light outside the room. The shadows of the bedroom swallowed her, and she moved toward the door in silence. As she stepped into the hallway, the air felt colder than before, and the weight of something unseen seemed to press down on her. The house felt alive. The walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She walked carefully, her feet barely making a sound, her every step measured, though her heart raced faster with every inch of space she crossed. The weeping had started again, this time quieter, but more distinct. It was coming from the living room, deeper into the house. She moved toward it, each step heavy with the sense that she was being watched. She could feel her own pulse in her ears, but it wasn't her anxiety she was hearing. It was the sound of something else, something inside the house that shared her fear. The living room was dark, but the moonlight from the windows barely illuminated the far corner where the wall seemed to shimmer faintly. As Evelyn approached, her gaze fell on the spot where the weeping was coming from. The walls there, once dry, were now streaked with dark, viscous stains. The color was wrong, too red, too dark. It looked like blood, but the texture was different. It was like the wall was weeping with sorrow, not just moisture. Her breath caught in her throat, and she backed away, stumbling on the floor as her body screamed at her to turn and run. But something stopped her. A whisper, too soft to catch, too faint to understand, seemed to speak from the center of the room. "Help me." Evelyn's heart slammed in her chest. Her body screamed at her to leave, to find safety, to wake up, but her feet refused to move. She was frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the wall, from the blood-like marks that seemed to pulse in time with the whispers. Another whisper came, this time clearer. "You're not alone." Before Evelyn could react, the sound of footsteps behind her sent a jolt of terror through her body. She whirled around, ready to flee, but there was no one there. The house felt as if it were closing in. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. Her breath misted in the air. She shivered uncontrollably, the cold pressing against her skin like fingers. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, the darkness forming shapes that moved, twisting just out of the corner of her eye. The walls wept again. She was no longer sure what was real. A movement caught her attention, a small figure just at the edge of the room. A silhouette. It was a girl standing in the shadows. She looked like a child, no older than 6 or 7, with long, dark hair that hung in tangled strands over her face. Her clothes were torn, stained, and old. The girl's eyes were wide, black pits of darkness, hollow and empty. Her hands were outstretched toward Evelyn, as if begging her for help. The girl's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The only thing Evelyn could hear was the weeping, louder now, coming from everywhere. The sound filled her ears, ringing, suffocating. Evelyn couldn't move. Her body was frozen, and her mouth was dry as dust. She couldn't look away from the child, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Get out. But she couldn't. The girl stepped forward one shaky step at a time, her tiny feet barely making a sound. The shadows seemed to reach for her, as though trying to pull her back into the darkness. Evelyn couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was trapped in a room, trapped in a house, trapped with the ghost of a girl who had died, who was never supposed to be here. Then, without warning, the child's face twisted. Her mouth stretched wide, unnaturally so, her eyes now glowing with a strange, sickening light. Leave. The word was a low growl, an echo that rattled Evelyn's bones. The girl's form began to shift, distorting, and the walls seemed to close in around her, pressing in tighter and tighter. Evelyn could feel the weight of the house itself crushing her chest. She had to leave, but the moment she turned to run, the weeping started again, louder, more intense, as if the walls themselves were crying out in anguish. Her feet felt heavy, as if they were bound to the floor. With everything inside her screaming for escape, Evelyn pushed through the fear, forced her legs to move, and bolted down the hallway, back toward the bedroom. Her breath was ragged, her chest tight, and the sound of footsteps followed her every move. Just as she reached the door, she felt the sharp, icy grip of a hand on her arm. She screamed. Then the door slammed shut. Evelyn gasped, her body jerking back as the door slammed shut behind her. The sound of the lock clicking into place was deafening, as though the house itself had sealed her in. She turned toward the door, her hands shaking violently as she fumbled for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Her breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. She could hear the girls weeping again, the sound now rising and falling with an unnatural rhythm, as if something inside the walls were feeding on the terror that had gripped her. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had to get out. The house was alive, and it was hungry. She turned, her back pressed against the door, her eyes darting around the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch even further, twisting and warping as if they had a life of their own. The pale moonlight coming through the window cast an eerie glow across the room, illuminating the stains on the walls. The blood-like marks had spread further, creeping up to the ceiling in twisted, grotesque shapes, like the handprints of something or someone trying to claw its way out. Leave, the girl had whispered. Leave. But where could she go? Every inch of the house felt like it was closing in on her. She took a few unsteady steps back, her eyes flicking toward the bed. The bedroom seemed so far away, but the hallway was worse. She couldn't go back to the hallway, not after seeing the child, not after feeling the pressure of the walls around her, closing in, tightening, suffocating her. Evelyn's fingers brushed over the edge of the bedpost, trying to steady herself, but then a noise. A faint scratching sound from behind the walls. At first, she thought it was the house settling again, but then the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Something or someone was clawing its way through the plaster. Her breath hitched, her body rigid with fear. She stumbled backward, her gaze locked on the wall, her mind reeling with possibilities. The sound was growing louder, more desperate. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the shadows now seemed to pulse. Something was coming. The door behind her rattled again, as if the weight of the house itself was pushing against it. Evelyn spun, her fingers fumbling for the lock, but the knob refused to turn. She felt a cold gust of air brush against her neck, and her stomach churned. It wasn't coming from the open window. There was no breeze. No, the house itself was breathing. Panic surged through her veins, and without thinking, she threw herself against the door, pushing against it with every ounce of strength in her body. The walls felt as though they were pressing against her, as if the very structure of the house was alive, watching, waiting for her to break. Leave. The whisper echoed in her mind again, louder now, more insistent, but it was too late. The door creaked in protest, and then, with a final snap, the latch released. Evelyn staggered forward, gasping for air, only to feel a cold, invisible hand clamp around her wrist. Her heart stopped. She twisted, her breath catching in her throat, her mind spinning as she struggled to break free. But the grip tightened, cold as death, pulling her back. She screamed, her voice high and terrified, but no sound came from her mouth, as if the house had stolen her voice. Her eyes darted to the hallway, to the living room, and she saw it, the girl, standing at the threshold. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth stretched wide in a grotesque smile, and her hands reached out, fingers twitching. "You can't leave," the girl's voice echoed, but it wasn't her voice anymore. It was the voice of the house itself, ancient and hollow, like the wind whispering through rotting bones. Evelyn's chest tightened, and she fought against the invisible grip holding her back. She tried to scream again, but her throat was tight, strangled by the force of whatever was pulling her in. The shadows grew darker, thicker, wrapping around her like tendrils, twisting and shifting as the walls seemed to breathe in sync with the movement. The weeping had turned into something worse, an endless, mournful wail that shook her to her core, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. She was trapped. "Let me go," Evelyn cried out, finally finding her voice again, her words coming out ragged and hoarse. She twisted her arm, desperate to free herself from the unseen hand, but it only tightened, pulling her toward the girl, pulling her toward the heart of the house. The girl stepped closer, her smile growing wider, her movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of Evelyn's terror. Her tiny feet barely touched the floor as she glided forward, the darkness at her back growing stronger, reaching out like a tide. "Leave, and it will be over," the girl said, her voice barely a whisper now. Evelyn didn't know what the girl meant, but in that moment, she understood. The house wasn't just haunted by a spirit, it was a spirit. The walls, the floors, the very foundation of the house. It was alive, feeding off the sorrow and fear of those who dared to live within it. The grip on her wrist loosened just enough for her to yank herself free. She didn't think, she just ran. With every step, the house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The air itself thickened, pressing in on her, and the shadows whispered her name, urging her to stop, to turn back. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. She reached the front door, and for a moment, she thought she might make it out. She grabbed the handle, her fingers numb with cold, but then the door slammed shut. The walls groaned around her. The house was alive, breathing, suffocating. Evelyn stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. She could feel it now, the presence, the thing that had been watching her all along. It wasn't just the girl. It was the house itself, feeding off her fear, her desperation, her every movement. She was never going to leave. Evelyn's breath came in frantic gasps as she backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. Every inch of the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy vibrating under her feet. The walls trembled as if the house itself were breathing, its hunger growing, and the shadows seemed to thicken and stretch in response to her fear. She could still hear the girl's voice, faint but insistent, as if it were whispering directly into her mind. "Leave." The words echoed through her skull, a command she couldn't ignore. Evelyn's pulse raced faster, and she felt as though the house was swallowing her whole, pulling her deeper into its suffocating grasp. She turned away from the door, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape. But the room felt like it had shrunk. The walls had moved closer. The space was closing in, constricting her, and she could feel the air growing thicker with every passing second. She had no idea how much time had passed, but it didn't matter. She had to get out. The house was never going to let her leave unless she fought back. Her gaze landed on the window, the cold light of the moon streaming through the dusty glass. It was small, but if she could break it, she could climb through. It was her only chance. Evelyn dashed toward it, but just as her fingers touched the window frame, the floor beneath her trembled violently, and a sharp, shrill scream filled the air, so loud, so full of anguish, that it made her stomach churn and her ears ring. She staggered back, her hands covering her ears, but the scream pierced through, rattling her bones. It came from the walls again, louder now, as though 1,000 voices were crying out in unison, mourning a lost life, a lost soul. Then she saw it. The wall opposite her, where the bloodstains had been creeping, began to crack. The plaster bulged outward as if something large and heavy was pushing from the inside. It was like watching a body slowly being forced through a thin skin. The blood-like stains dripped from the cracks, pooling at the floor. The smell was overpowering, a mix of rot and something far worse, something that made her stomach churn. Evelyn's hands shook as she backed away, her feet slipping on the slick floor beneath her. She could feel the house's weight bearing down on her, like a giant hand pressing, squeezing. She couldn't breathe. The sound of nails scraping against wood echoed through the house, dragging through the silence like the slow sharpening of a blade. Evelyn turned, eyes wide with terror, and saw the girl standing there again. But this time, she wasn't just standing. The girl was crawling, her body twisting unnaturally as she moved toward Evelyn, her tiny hands dragging along the floor. The black voids of her eyes stared directly at her, unblinking, and her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, revealing jagged, broken teeth. "You can't escape," the girl whispered, her voice far too deep for such a small child, as though it came from the house itself. She raised her hand, the fingers twitching, and Evelyn felt the cold grip again, this time wrapping around her ankle. The girl's smile grew wider, more hungry, and Evelyn could feel the presence of the house closing in from all sides. No, no, no. Desperation surged through her. She had to escape. She couldn't die here. Not like this. With one final, frantic motion, Evelyn yanked herself free from the girl's grip, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stumbled toward the window again, fingers scrabbling at the frame, trying to push it open. But it wouldn't budge. The girl's voice echoed again, sharp and mocking. "You think you can run?" The walls groaned like something alive, and Evelyn felt the temperature drop. The chill cut through her like ice. The walls shifted, the space in the room narrowing with every passing second, closing in on her. The door was still locked, the window still sealed. She was trapped. There was no way out. There's always a way. The whisper came again, only this time it wasn't from the girl. It was something deeper, something ancient. The house itself had spoken. Evelyn's head snapped up, her breath shallow, her hands shaking as she turned slowly in the direction of the voice. The walls, they were moving. The plaster began to shift and bend, as if the house were morphing itself, reshaping itself around her. The girl was no longer crawling. She was floating now, her form becoming less human, her body expanding and contracting like a grotesque distortion of reality. Her smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it consumed her entire face, and her empty eyes bored into Evelyn's soul. "There is no escape," the voice said, and it was as if the entire house had spoken in unison. But then, something inside Evelyn snapped. The terror, the helplessness, it all gave way to something else. Eerie, desperation, a refusal to be consumed by this place, by this thing. She grabbed a nearby lamp, the only object in the room that felt solid, and with all the strength she had left, she hurled it against the wall. It shattered on impact, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. For a moment, everything was still, and then the girl screamed. It was a sound so high-pitched, so full of agony, that Evelyn had to cover her ears. The walls buckled in response, groaning as if in pain. The girl's body contorted, her smile turning into a scream that rattled the very bones of the house. The shadows twisted, warping, as if the house were trying to tear itself apart from the inside. Evelyn staggered back, her eyes wide with disbelief. She couldn't understand it. How could a house be alive? How could something this evil exist? But in that moment, she understood. The house had been built on something dark. A curse. A pact. It had fed on the souls of those who dared enter. And now it wanted hers. And then, just as the walls seemed to close in for the final time, something strange happened. The house shifted. The pressure around her eased, and the voices, the cries, the weeping, all of it faded into nothing. For a brief, impossible moment, everything was silent. And then she heard it. A sound she couldn't comprehend at first. A whisper, soft, cold, and final. Leave. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached for the door again. This time, the lock clicked open with no resistance. She didn't think. She just ran. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted down the narrow hallway, her feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. She didn't dare look back. Every instinct in her screamed that if she stopped, even for a second, the house would swallow her whole. It was alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy, and she was its prey. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached the staircase, her hands gripping the railing for support as she hurried down. The air felt thick, heavier than before, as if the very atmosphere had become laden with dread. The shadows in the corners seemed to whisper, curling around her, trying to reach for her as she moved. She reached the front door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. For a fleeting moment, the thought crossed her mind that she might never escape, that the door might never open. But then, with a desperate twist, she pulled it. The door swung open. For a second, the cold night air outside felt like a distant memory. The house loomed behind her, oppressive, suffocating. But she didn't hesitate. She bolted out into the night. She didn't stop running, not even as her feet hit the damp ground outside. The house, dark and looming behind her, felt like an invisible weight pressing on her back. She could still feel the oppressive gaze of its walls, the silent hunger that clung to her, unwilling to let her go. Evelyn kept running, her breaths ragged, her legs burning, until the house disappeared from sight, hidden by the dark trees of the surrounding forest. She didn't know where she was going or how far she had to run to escape. She just knew she had to keep moving. The woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves beneath her feet. The air was cold, and every breeze sent a shiver down her spine. There was a sense of something watching, but she couldn't tell if it was just the terror still clinging to her or something more. She paused for a moment, her chest heaving with exertion, and looked back over her shoulder. The house was gone, hidden in the shadows of the trees. She thought she could see a faint light flickering through the forest, like a candle held by an unseen hand. But when she blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. The house's influence was still there, lingering like a dark cloud in her thoughts. Every part of her felt shattered, as if she had narrowly escaped something far worse than death. Evelyn leaned against a tree, trying to steady her breath, but then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible weeping. It was far off, but unmistakable. Her blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her body tense, scanning the trees around her. The sound was distant, but it was growing louder. A woman's cry, then a child's voice, crying for help. She couldn't stay here. The house, it wasn't gone. It had followed her. The presence was there, deep in the woods, feeding off her fear like it always had. And she knew it wouldn't stop until it had her. Evelyn stumbled backward, her chest tight with terror. She had to leave. She had to find someone. Anyone. But the weeping continued, now mixed with faint, distorted laughter. Then she saw it. In the darkness between the trees, a figure emerged, a child. The same girl. Her dark hair hung limp over her face, and her pale, cracked hands reached toward Evelyn, as if pleading for help. Her mouth opened, the familiar, grotesque smile stretching far too wide. You can't escape. Evelyn froze in place. The air was thick with the same unnatural cold as before. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice caught somewhere deep inside her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get away from the girl, but her legs refused to move. You were never meant to leave, the girl whispered again, her voice now twisted, something ancient and evil slipping through her words. The shadows around her deepened, shifting like smoke, and then, from the corners of her vision, Evelyn saw the trees moving. No, not the trees, something else, something darker, creeping toward her. Evelyn spun around and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she pushed through the thick underbrush. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away. She could hear the footsteps behind her, heavy, dragging, as if something was chasing her. The girl's laughter echoed in her ears. She wasn't alone in the woods. The trees twisted and the shadows pressed in closer. The night was no longer just dark, it was suffocating. The weeping and laughter continued to grow louder, distorting and echoing through the trees. And then there was something else. A voice. A low, hollow whisper that came from the ground beneath her feet. "You can't outrun it, Evelyn." Her heart stopped. She froze, panic seizing her body. The voice was familiar. It wasn't a girl. It was something else. Something much older, much more powerful. Something that had always been there, in the very ground she had walked on. The forest floor shifted, and Evelyn felt something cold, something wet brush against her ankle. She gasped and looked down. Her feet were submerged in dark, viscous liquid. The ground was no longer solid, but soft, as if it were breathing. The earth beneath her feet was alive, shifting, changing. The laughter from the girl grew louder, as did the cries of the others, voices twisting together in an agonizing chorus. Evelyn's legs buckled beneath her as she collapsed to the ground. She could feel the earth pulling at her, dragging her down into the suffocating darkness. The weeping and the laughter merged into a single, maddening sound that threatened to drive her insane. Her hands clawed at the dirt, tried to pull herself free, but the ground was too slick, too soft, as though it were made of flesh, not earth. It was alive, feeding on her fear. "Help me," she whispered hoarsely, not sure if the words were meant for herself or for the voices. But deep down, she knew no one was coming. No one had ever come. And then, from the darkness, she saw the girl again. Her mouth opened wider, the twisted smile returning. The voids of her eyes seemed to draw Evelyn in, pulling her deeper into the nightmarish landscape of woods. The girl whispered, and the world around Evelyn collapsed into darkness. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears as the world seemed to close in around her. The shadows, once distant and hazy, now seemed to surge toward her, twisting and writhing like living tendrils. The darkness swallowed everything, pulling at her body, her mind, and her very soul. She could feel the cold earth beneath her fingertips, slick and wet, as though it were alive, breathing with a hunger that was her own. She tried to push herself up, to rise from the grip of the earth that was pulling her down, but her body felt heavier than it ever had before. Her limbs trembled, barely able to hold her up as the shadows seemed to grow sharper, more defined, and closer. The laughter, the weeping, the voice of the girl, it all blended together, drowning out her thoughts. "It's time." The whisper came again, as cold and chilling as the night air. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. Her mouth opened, but it was as if the very air around her had turned to stone, choking her, holding her in place. The girl stood in front of her now, her form more solid than before, the darkness that surrounded her wrapping tighter around Evelyn's body. Her smile had turned into something more sinister, an impossibly wide grin that stretched beyond the confines of a human face. The girl's eyes, those black, endless pits, stared directly at Evelyn, as though they could see right through her. "You can't escape," the girl whispered again, her voice now layered with a deep, guttural undertone, like something ancient speaking through her. Evelyn's heart raced. She couldn't let this happen. She had fought this far, had gotten out of the house, out of the hell it had trapped her in. She wouldn't be consumed by it now. Think. The words echoed in her mind as she clawed at the ground beneath her, her nails scraping the dirt. She had to get up. She had to keep running, keep fighting. Then, as if responding to her desperation, the ground beneath her shifted. The earth that had tried to drag her down loosened, and for a brief moment, she felt free, unshackled, unbound. It was the smallest, most fleeting of chances, but it was enough. With a final cry of pure terror and strength, Evelyn forced herself up. She stumbled to her feet, legs shaky but determined. She didn't care where she was running anymore. She just needed to be away from the girl, from the suffocating dark, from whatever this cursed place was. Her breath came out in sharp gasps as she sprinted through the woods, the tangled branches of trees scratching at her skin, the leaves underfoot a cacophony of noise. The weeping and the laughter followed her, echoing through the trees like ghosts mocking her attempts to escape. Her heart beat so loudly in her chest that it drowned out all other sounds, and the pressure in the air felt like a vice around her ribs. Suddenly, she saw it. The faint light she had glimpsed earlier, like a distant star, shone through the trees. It wasn't just a flicker now. It was steady, pulsing with an almost otherworldly glow. It felt like a promise, a beacon of something real, something outside of the nightmare she was trapped in. Without thinking, Evelyn ran toward it. Her legs screamed with pain, her chest burned with exertion, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The light was her only hope. She broke through the last of the underbrush and found herself standing on the edge of a clearing. The light she had seen was coming from a house, a small, humble cottage, its windows glowing with warmth, the door ajar, inviting her in. It was different from the oppressive, suffocating house she had fled. This was a house of safety, of refuge. Or so it seemed. The air around the cottage felt different, lighter, clearer. Evelyn hesitated, her mind racing. She wasn't sure whether this was another trick of the house or if she had truly found escape. But she had no other choice. With trembling hands, she stepped forward and entered the cottage. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and for the first time since she had stepped into the cursed house in the woods, she felt calm. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth filled the room, and the scent of herbs and spices lingered in the air. It looked like an ordinary cottage, small but cozy. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and trinkets, and a faded rug covered the wooden floor. It felt real solid. There were no shadows moving in the corners, no whispers or laughter. But then, the door opened behind her. Evelyn spun, her body tensing, her heart pounding in her chest again. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall, thin man with dark, piercing eyes. He wore an old, weathered cloak, and his face was partially obscured by the hood, but there was no mistaking the presence that he carried. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, but not unkind. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. This wasn't a house. It was something else. Something older, something more ancient. She stammered, her throat tight. "I had to escape. I didn't know where else to go." The man took a step forward, his gaze heavy, unreadable. "The house you ran from. It's not like any other. It's not just a house. It's an entity, a being that consumes all who enter. You can't outrun it. You can't hide from it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Then, "Why am I safe here?" she whispered. The man's lips twisted into a grim smile. "You're not safe here." He stepped closer, his eyes darkening. "But you can still make a choice. The house wants your soul, and it will follow you, no matter where you go." Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides, her mind racing. The darkness, the girl, the house. It hadn't let her go. It never would. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's eyes glinted, as if he had been waiting for her to ask that very question. "You must go back." Evelyn shook her head, disbelief flashing through her. "Back? Back to that house." "Yes." The man's voice softened. "The house will never stop until it has you. But there's a way to break its hold, a way to sever the bond." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You must confront it. You must confront the evil at the heart of the house. Only then can you break free." The man's words hung in the air like a dark omen, and Evelyn felt the weight of their meaning settle heavily on her shoulders. It was not over. Not yet. Evelyn's heart felt like it had stopped. Confront it? The words the man spoke seemed impossible, like a riddle that had no clear answer. The house. The entity that had haunted her, trapped her, and nearly consumed her. It wasn't just a building. It wasn't just some malevolent spirit that she could fight off with willpower or escape from by running. It was a force, ancient, all-consuming, and it wanted her. But the man, he spoke as if there were a way to break its hold. to destroy it. How? Evelyn had no idea, but she knew that she couldn't let the house win. She couldn't go back to that place, couldn't allow herself to be consumed by its darkness. Why would I go back? She asked, her voice trembling despite her best effort to stay steady. Why would I willingly return to that nightmare? The man's dark eyes met hers, unwavering. Because you have no choice. His voice was firm, yet there was a softness there too, as if he understood the pain she was going through. It won't stop. The house will follow you. It will tear apart every place you seek refuge, every life you try to build. It feeds on fear, on the terror of the souls it traps. But there is something at its heart, something you must face. Only then can you truly break free. Evelyn's mind spun. Face it, how could she face something that bent reality, something that had already shown her horrors beyond her comprehension? How could she face the malevolent force that had once seemed so invincible? What do you mean by its heart? She whispered, stepping back as if trying to put distance between herself and the truth he was revealing. What does that even mean? The man stood tall, his gaze never wavering. The house was built on blood, not just any blood, the blood of those who swore allegiance to the dark forces that rule it. They crafted it with their own hands, bound it with their very souls. The house is alive because of the pact they made, but it wasn't always like this. Evelyn's chest tightened. She could hardly breathe. What happened? The man's face darkened, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a flicker of something painful cross his features. A family. A powerful family. They made a deal with something beyond our world, a being of darkness, a demon or god, something older than time itself. In return for power, wealth, and eternal life, they gave their souls, their children, their very blood. But they didn't realize the price they'd have to pay until it was too late. He paused, his eyes flicking to the fire in the hearth, as if lost in some memory. The house became a prison, a place to trap the souls of the guilty, and anyone else who dared enter. Over the years, it has fed on the souls of its victims, but not just to survive. It feeds to grow, to spread its influence, to infect the world with its evil. The gravity of his words hit Evelyn like a punch to the stomach. The house wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a trap for souls. It had always been. And it wasn't just after her. It was after everyone. The people who had built it, the ones who had made the pact. It wanted to consume them all. And if it had her, it would have her soul, too. So, what exactly do I need to do? Evelyn asked, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. The man's face hardened. You must go back to the house. You need to find the heart of it, the core where the original pact was made. You must break the pact, destroy the house's hold on this world. If you do this, you will release the trapped souls, and the house will be free to decay, its power slipping away like sand through your fingers. But be warned, if you fail, if you hesitate for even a second, the house will claim you, and you will become one of its prisoners. Evelyn felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. There was no easy way out, no happy ending. She had thought that leaving the house behind would be the end of her nightmare, but the man's words made it clear that the nightmare was only beginning. Evelyn asked, her voice hollow with the terror of knowing the answer. The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze was steady, and his voice, when it came, was quiet but final. Then the house will claim you, body, mind, and soul, and it will continue to feed on your fear until there is nothing left. No one will be safe, not even the people you care about. It's not just your soul the house seeks. It wants more. It wants to spread, and it won't stop until it has what it wants. Evelyn stood there for a moment, the man's words sinking in. There was no turning back. She couldn't run anymore. She had to confront the evil that had already marked her. She had to end it, or it would continue to haunt her and everyone else forever. For a long time, she stood in silence, contemplating. The cottage around her suddenly felt too quiet, too peaceful. It almost felt wrong, as though it wasn't truly a safe place after all. Her hands trembled at her sides, and her breath quickened. What was the cost? What would happen if she couldn't face it? Her gaze turned back to the man, her fear now mingling with a desperate, determined resolve. I'll do it. I'll go back. The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing else. He moved toward her, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. You are stronger than you realize, but you must go now. The longer you wait, the stronger the house will grow. The longer you hesitate, the harder it will be to defeat it. Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing the terror down. She had faced the girl, the shadows, the endless horrors that had tried to claim her. But she had never truly fought back. She had always been running, always been afraid. Now, there would be no more running. She had to face it. For herself. For everyone it had ever touched. With one final glance at the firelit room, Evelyn turned and walked toward the door. She could feel the pull of the house in the pit of her stomach, the weight of its hunger gnawing at her. It wasn't over. It had never been over, but she was going to make sure it was. Evelyn stepped into the cold night air, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, the trees standing silent as if they too were waiting for what was to come. The cottage behind her was now just a distant memory, its warm light fading into the shadows of the woods. There was no turning back. As she walked through the woods, the chilling silence pressed down on her, broken only by the occasional rustle of the leaves underfoot. The moonlight cut through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for her, as though the very woods were alive, aware of her presence. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Each step felt heavier than the last, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth, as if the ground itself was reluctant to let her go. The deeper she walked into the forest, the more the oppressive darkness seemed to close in. Her thoughts were clouded with the image of the house, the twisted, decaying mansion that had once been a prison and now seemed to be waiting for her return. The air grew colder the closer she got to the clearing. She could hear the wind picking up, howling through the trees, as if it were warning her. The scent of damp earth and decaying wood filled her nostrils, and she felt the familiar pulse of the house in the distance, a heavy, malevolent presence that sent a shiver through her spine. Then she saw it, the house, looming through the trees, its silhouette darker than the night itself. The windows were like empty eyes, watching her, waiting. It seemed to grow taller and more monstrous with each step she took toward it, its crumbling facade twisted and broken, as though it had been weathered by centuries of suffering. The porch was barely standing, the wooden boards creaking with every gust of wind. The door stood wide open, like a gaping maw, beckoning her inside. Evelyn paused at the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her stomach twisted with fear. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee, but she couldn't. Not this time. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the house. The moment her foot touched the floor, the air seemed to change. It grew colder, thicker. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to stir, as if alive, stretching toward her. The silence inside was deafening, the kind of silence that felt wrong. There was no creaking of the house settling, no sound of wind, nothing but the oppressive stillness that smothered every inch of the place. Evelyn moved cautiously through the entryway, her eyes scanning the darkness. The house felt like a tomb, its walls whispering memories of all the souls that had been trapped here before her. She could almost hear them, faint cries, muffled sobs, distant laughter that echoed off the walls like the mocking voice of a nightmare. But the voices were not the worst part. It was the presence, that sense that something was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She reached the grand staircase, its once beautiful banister now rotted and splintered, the steps creaking ominously underfoot. The house seemed to groan with each step she took, as if it were a living thing, aware of her every movement. She could feel the weight of its hunger pressing in on her, and she had to fight the urge to run, to turn and flee from the nightmare that awaited her. But she was beyond that now. Evelyn ascended the stairs, her mind focused on one thing: the heart of the house, the place where the pact had been made. She had no idea where to find it, but she knew it had to be somewhere at the core of this place, buried deep within the house's twisted foundations. It was the only way to break the hold the house had over her. As she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed a narrow hallway stretching out before her. The walls were cracked, peeling with age, and the flickering light from the distant windows cast long, eerie shadows that danced along the floor. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else, an overwhelming stench of decay, of something rotting beneath the layers of time. She turned left and walked down the hallway, each step making the floorboards groan beneath her feet. The doors on either side were half open, revealing rooms that were shrouded in darkness. Some were empty, their contents long forgotten, while others were filled with old, broken furniture that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. At the end of the hall, she saw a door. It was different from the others, solid, dark wood, its edges carved with strange, intricate symbols that seemed to move, shifting as her eyes traced them. The door called to her. She could feel the pull, a magnetic force that seemed to urge her forward, as if the house itself was guiding her toward it. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay beyond. She stepped forward and grasped the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, but when she twisted it, the door opened with a soft, unsettling creak. The room inside was vast, its ceiling stretching up high into darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they were filled with jars of things she couldn't name, things that didn't belong in the human world. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped inside. At the center of the room stood an altar draped in old, tattered cloth. The stone surface gleamed faintly in the dim light, as if it were alive, pulsating with a dark energy. And on the altar, lying in the center, was a blackened, cracked heart, a heart that seemed to beat with the rhythm of the house itself, as though it were the very source of its evil. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the heart, the core of the house. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out toward it, but as her fingers brushed the surface, the house seemed to shudder, its walls groaning in protest. The temperature dropped, and the shadows around her seemed to come alive, reaching out with dark tendrils, trying to pull her back. "You should not have come back," a voice whispered in the dark. It was a voice she recognized, a voice that had haunted her nightmares. The girl. "You cannot stop it." The girl's voice echoed again, now more distorted, more alien, as if it were no longer just a voice, but an entire presence. "You are mine. You cannot escape." Evelyn's heart raced, her fingers tightening around the altar as the darkness closed in. She could hear the house groaning, its walls bending as if the very foundation of the world was shifting, cracking open. "This is the end," the girl whispered, the voice growing louder, suffocating. But Evelyn was done running. She had come this far. She reached for the heart with both hands, her palms pressed against the cold surface, feeling the pulse of the house vibrating through her fingertips. And then, with all the strength she had left, she pulled. The heart resisted. It was as though the entire house was alive, trying to keep it in place, its weight becoming unbearable. But Evelyn didn't stop. She pulled harder, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she yanked with all her might. And with a final, shuddering scream, the heart came free. The house screamed with it. The moment the heart tore free from the altar, the house screamed. It was a sound like no other, a deafening, guttural wail that echoed through every inch of the mansion. The very foundation seemed to tremble beneath her feet, and the walls, once solid, began to warp and crack as though the house itself were unraveling. Evelyn gripped the blackened heart in both hands, its pulsating rhythm now more erratic, almost frantic, as if the house was panicking, as if it knew its time had come. The shadows that had been creeping toward her retreated, writhing in the corners of the room like wounded animals. But the power of the heart still held them at bay for now. No! The girl's voice echoed in her mind again, sharper this time, full of rage and fear. You can't. You'll never be free. Evelyn staggered back, clutching the heart to her chest as the walls of the house groaned, shifting violently. She felt the house's malevolent presence all around her, pressing in on her, whispering promises of doom and despair. The cold, the darkness, the whispers, they were all trying to pull her down, to drag her back into the suffocating depths of the nightmare. But Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. Her hands were raw from the pressure of the heart, but she refused to let go. Her fingers dug into the blackened flesh of the thing, and she could feel its power, a dark, ancient force that had been sealed away for centuries, coursing through her. She had to destroy it. She had to end it. The heart pulsed one last time, and in that moment, she realized the truth. She couldn't just destroy the heart. She had to burn it. She had to tear it apart completely until nothing was left. If the heart was the key to the house's power, then she had to burn it to ash, to free the souls trapped within the walls, to sever the house's grip on this world. Evelyn's breath was ragged, but her mind was clear. She turned, her eyes searching the room for something, anything that could help her. Her gaze fell on a shelf near the wall, covered in dust and cobwebs. On it sat a small brass lantern, its glass cracked but still intact. Without a second thought, Evelyn ran to it, her legs shaking with the effort. She grabbed the lantern, pulling it off the shelf, and with a trembling hand, she opened the lid. The oil inside sloshed as she tipped it, spilling out onto the floor. She didn't hesitate. She lit the wick with a nearby match, the tiny flame flickering in the dark room. She didn't look back as she ran toward the altar, her heart hammering in her chest. Holding the lantern with one hand and the heart with the other, she placed the heart on the floor and poured the oil over it. It soaked into the blackened flesh, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then, with a crackling sound, the oil ignited, and flames began to lick at the edges of the heart. The shadows in the room recoiled, the house screaming in agony as the fire spread, growing hotter, brighter. The floorboards creaked and groaned as though they were about to collapse. The walls began to shake, and the ceiling above her cracked, pieces of plaster falling like hailstones. You can't. The girl's voice echoed one final time, a shrill wail of desperation. You'll burn with it. You'll never escape. Evelyn ignored her. She could feel the heat of the fire now, the warmth that was both comforting and terrifying at the same time. The flames danced hungrily across the heart, and with every passing second, the house seemed to crumble further, the foundations giving way. But then, just as she thought it was over, just as she thought the house was finished, something changed. The shadows stopped moving. The house went still. And then, with a final, bone-shaking crack, the heart shattered. The sound was like 1,000 glass windows shattering all at once. And for a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. The fire roared, surging upward like a wild animal set loose, and the house around her began to disintegrate, the walls and floors dissolving into dust. The once powerful presence, the feeling of something ancient and suffocating, vanished. Evelyn staggered backward as the last of the house's walls crumbled away. The ground beneath her feet trembled, then cracked open, swallowing the rest of the house in a cloud of dust and debris. The air grew still and quiet, the oppressive weight lifting from her shoulders as the mansion, with all its horrors and nightmares, disappeared. The house was gone. For a long time, Evelyn stood in the ruins, her chest heaving as she stared at the place where the house had once stood. The moonlight shone down, now clear and bright, without the shadows that had once stretched across the land like a living thing. The forest around her was still, as though it too had been freed from the curse. She felt empty. The weight that had followed her for so long was gone. but she couldn't shake the feeling of loss, the loss of the people who had been trapped inside, the souls that had been consumed by the house's hunger. She closed her eyes, taking a slow, steady breath. She was free, but that didn't mean the scars would ever fade. Evelyn opened her eyes, looking out across the clearing where the house had been. The darkness had lifted, but she knew that she could never forget what had happened here. The house had claimed so much from her peace, her sanity, her hope, and though it was gone, the memory would remain forever etched in her mind. She turned away from the ruin of the house, her body exhausted, but her soul lighter. She had won, but at what cost? Evelyn walked away from the ruins, each step feeling like she was leaving a piece of herself behind. The forest around her was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural after the chaos she'd just experienced. The faint glow of the moon bathed the path ahead, its light gentle and steady, almost like a promise that the nightmare was truly over. But the weight of everything she had faced still pressed heavily on her chest. She had destroyed the house. She had freed herself from its curse. But at what cost? The echoes of the spirits that had once haunted the mansion lingered in the back of her mind. She could still hear their whispers, the faint voices of those who had been consumed, lost forever in the darkness of the house. They were gone now, yes, but their memories would never fade. She had set them free, but in doing so, she had left a part of herself behind in that place. A part that would never heal. Evelyn glanced behind her one last time, her eyes scanning the empty clearing where the house had once stood. The ground was bare now, the earth scarred, but nothing else remained. No traces of the mansion's twisted structure, no traces of its malevolent presence. The house had dissolved into nothingness, its evil erased from the world. The trees around her seemed to breathe easier now, their branches swaying gently in the wind. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. There was nothing left for her in this place. But she didn't know where to go. She had no home, no family waiting for her. The people who had once loved her, who had once been a part of her life, were now distant memories, fragments lost in the shadow of everything that had happened. The house had taken it all from her. The life she had known was gone, and she was left with nothing but the scars of what she'd survived. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the man, the one who had warned her about the house, the one who had told her what needed to be done. She had never asked him who he was, why he knew so much about the house. But somehow, she felt he had known all along what was going to happen. He had watched, waited, and when the time came, he had given her the strength to finish it. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But Evelyn knew one thing for sure now. She couldn't live in the past. She couldn't let the house continue to haunt her, even if its horrors had scarred her in ways that would never fully heal. The night air was crisp, biting at her skin as she walked further into the woods. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't even know if she wanted to keep going. But one foot in front of the other, one step at a time, and maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild. She would have to. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air, a subtle change that caught her attention. Her eyes snapped to the side, and she saw something in the distance. A flicker of movement. The outline of a figure, standing near the edge of the forest. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it him? The man? The one who had guided her here? Or was it someone else? Someone. Or something. Watching her from the shadows? Her pulse quickened, but she didn't stop. She didn't turn away. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its eyes on her, and the air between them seemed to crackle with an energy that wasn't quite human. Then, as she approached, the figure slowly faded away, vanishing into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. Evelyn froze, her heart racing. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. She swallowed hard, tried to steady her breathing. Had she imagined it? Had it been a lingering trace of the house's evil, still following her? She shook her head. No, she wouldn't let it. She couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding in the shadows of her fears. If there was one thing the house had taught her, it was that she had to face whatever came next. Whether it was the past, a new nightmare, or something she couldn't even comprehend yet, she had to face it head on. Evelyn took another step forward, determined, her gaze steady on the path ahead. The wind picked up again, but it felt different now. It wasn't suffocating or cruel. It felt freeing, as if it were inviting her to move forward, to live again. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt like she could breathe. And so, with the moonlight guiding her way, she walked into the night, leaving the ruins of the house behind, but carrying the lessons of her journey with her. Lessons of strength, survival, and the unshakable will to face whatever came next. The end. Or is it? Evelyn kept walking, her feet barely making a sound against the damp earth. The night air was cooler now, more still, and yet there was a feeling of weightlessness that had replaced the suffocating grip of the house's evil. She had thought she was walking toward freedom, but now, with the mysterious figure vanishing into the trees, she wasn't so sure. The path ahead seemed both unfamiliar and unsettling, as if the world itself had shifted in some small way. Her mind raced with questions she had no answers to. Who had been watching her? Was it the same man who had helped her before? Or was it something else? Something darker, something she hadn't yet faced? The rustling of leaves behind her caught her attention, pulling her out of her thoughts. She froze, every muscle tensing in her body. Was it the figure again? Had it come back? She turned, scanning the shadows, her breath shallow in the cold night. The forest was silent, except for the gentle sigh of the wind through the trees. Nothing moved. She swallowed, feeling ridiculous. There was no one there. Yet, the feeling of being watched, that unnerving sensation, refused to leave. She had to keep moving. Her eyes caught sight of a distant clearing up ahead, the soft glow of the moon bathing the landscape in silver. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker at the edge of the trees, a shadow passing in and out of sight. Her heart skipped a beat. This wasn't over. The realization struck her like a blow to the chest. Even though the house was gone, even though the heart had been destroyed, the evil that had dwelled within it wasn't finished with her. She could feel it deep in her bones, creeping at the edges of her mind. She had thought she could escape, but there were no true escapes from something like that. But why hadn't it taken her yet? She had destroyed the heart, severed its hold. What was waiting for her now? Her pace quickened, her feet carrying her toward the clearing. The oppressive weight in the air had shifted, but it had not fully lifted. A deep unease settled in her chest, one that didn't feel like a product of the house, but rather of something else, something that had always been there, lingering in the shadows of her life. She reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. It was quiet here, too. Too quiet. And then she saw it. In the center of the clearing was a large, weathered stone. It was cracked, as if something had broken it long ago, but it was still standing. There were strange markings etched into the surface, glowing faintly, almost as though they were pulsing with life. Evelyn approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. The closer she got to the stone, the more the strange feeling in the air intensified. There was something about it that felt wrong, like a trap waiting to spring. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the stone, and immediately, a sharp, electric jolt ran through her. She gasped, stepping back, her heart racing. The markings on the stone flared to life, glowing brighter, and for a split second, the air around her seemed to warp. She felt as though she were being pulled into another space entirely, as if the earth beneath her feet was no longer solid. And then, just as suddenly, everything snapped back into place. Her head spun, dizziness overwhelming her for a moment, but she steadied herself against the stone. Her pulse thudded in her ears. What had just happened? No, this wasn't real. This can't be happening. The voice from the house whispered in her mind again, but now it felt different. Stronger. More desperate. You're not done, it hissed. The house is not gone. You can't destroy what was never meant to die. Evelyn stumbled away from the stone, her breath coming in short gasps. Her legs felt like jelly, and the ground beneath her was suddenly shifting, the earth trembling like it had a mind of its own. The shadows in the forest twisted and writhed, pulling together into something far darker. The air grew heavy again, thick with the oppressive weight of the house's malevolent presence. She turned, almost frantic now, as the darkness closed in around her. She could see shapes in the trees, figures moving just beyond the reach of the moonlight, but when she tried to focus on them, they melted back into the shadows. She heard whispers, low and guttural, like the moans of 1,000 lost souls. Her feet stumbled backward, and she finally turned and ran. The forest was no longer the same. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out, grasping at her, trying to hold her back. The very air she breathed was thick with the stench of rot, the same smell she had come to associate with the house. As she ran, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, too fast to be her own. Something was chasing her, but she couldn't bring herself to look. Her body screamed for escape, but the forest seemed endless, the path winding back on itself, as if it were leading her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. I won't go back, she thought fiercely, but it didn't matter. She was already too deep. The forest opened up again, but this time, the clearing wasn't empty. The stone was there, and standing before it, her heart sinking, was the girl, the one who had haunted the house. Her face was pale, her eyes dark pools of emptiness. She was staring directly at Evelyn, her lips twisted into a smile that wasn't quite human. "You try to break me," the girl's voice whispered, soft as silk but edged with malice. "But I'm not so easily destroyed. The house will never let you go. You will never be free." Evelyn staggered back, her mind spinning as she realized the truth. The house had never truly been the source of the evil. It was something else, something that had always been there, woven into the very fabric of this place, feeding off the suffering of all those trapped within its walls. It had tricked her into thinking she had destroyed it, but in reality, it had just been waiting for the right moment to reclaim her. And now, that moment had come. Her fingers curled into fists, determination surging through her. She had fought this far. She couldn't let it win. She wouldn't let it win. The girl stepped forward, her smile widening. "You can't escape," she whispered. Evelyn felt the power of the stone once again, a dark pulse rising from the earth. But this time, she wasn't going to run. She was going to finish it. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as the girl's smile widened impossibly, like a predator preparing to strike. The air was thick with the presence of something ancient and unyielding, something that had never been truly defeated. The stone beneath her feet hummed with a low, deep resonance, and the shadows pressed in tighter, growing thicker by the second. The girl took another step toward her, her bare feet silent against the earth. Her eyes locked onto Evelyn's, pupils dilated, as if she could see every corner of Evelyn's soul. "You can't run from me, Evelyn." Her voice was a soft, mocking whisper, a melody of torment. "You can't destroy what has always been. It was never just a house. It was always me." The realization hit Evelyn like a punch to the stomach. The house, the heart, the darkness, it was all connected to this girl, to something far older and more twisted than she could have ever imagined. The girl wasn't just a victim of the house. She was the house, its soul, its heart, its very essence. A spirit of ancient evil that had woven herself into the fabric of this cursed land, infecting everything in her path. She felt the weight of the past crashing down on her, a suffocating wave of despair. The girl, this twisted entity, had been born from the suffering of the souls trapped within the house. She had fed on their pain, their terror, and Evelyn had been foolish to think she could end it by destroying a single object. She had only freed the girl from the heart of the house, and in doing so, had brought her to life. You destroyed the heart, the girl continued, her voice dripping with venom. But hearts can regenerate. You should have known. You should have known that the real power was always me.
Evelyn took a step back, her body trembling, but she wouldn't let herself show fear. Not now. She had come too far. She reached out for the stone, feeling the pulse beneath her fingertips once again. The girl was right.
The house was never just a structure. It was alive, a parasite that had fused with the land. And this girl, she was its vessel, its source, its keeper. But Evelyn wasn't going to let this girl, this manifestation of terror, consume her. She wasn't going to let this cycle continue, let it claim more souls, more lives. Not if she could help it. Her mind raced. There had to be a way to destroy the stone, to sever the girl from the very heart of the land itself. The stone was the anchor, the source of the evil power that had kept this nightmare alive, and if she could shatter it. Evelyn's eyes darted around the clearing, her gaze locking onto the darkened shadows that seemed to coil and twist toward her. There had to be something, anything she could use. Her eyes fell on the remnants of the ruins behind her, the shattered stone pillars that had once supported the house.
Among the debris, she spotted a jagged piece of metal, the remnants of an old iron gate that had once been part of the mansion's twisted architecture. She moved toward it without hesitation, grabbing the shard, its sharp edge cold against her palm. The girl watched her silently, the smile never fading from her face. "You think you can stop me?" the girl whispered, a cruel laugh escaping her lips. "You're already too late." Evelyn ignored her. She wasn't going to listen to her taunts. She was done being afraid. With the shard in hand, she turned back to the stone. The markings were pulsing more fiercely now, as though they sensed the impending destruction. The air crackled, thick with malice, but Evelyn gritted her teeth and pressed the shard to the center of the stone. The stone resisted, a
sudden surge of power pushing back against her. She felt it, the raw force of centuries of pain and hatred coursing through the stone, trying to hold its form together, to keep its grip on the world. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She pressed harder. "Stop!" The girl's voice rang out, shrill and desperate. "You don't understand." But Evelyn didn't care. She had come too far. She slammed the shard into the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. The forest fell deathly silent, as if holding its breath. Then crack, the stone shattered, the sound of splitting rock reverberating through the clearing like thunder. The air seemed to bend, warping and twisting, as a pulse of dark energy erupted outward in all directions. Evelyn stumbled back, barely able to keep her feet under her, as the ground cracked open beneath her. The girl's shriek tore through the air, a sound so filled with fury and agony that Evelyn had to cover her ears to block it out. The shadows that had been twisting toward her suddenly broke apart, scattering into nothingness. The girl's form flickered, her body dissolving like smoke in a fire. "No!" The girl's voice echoed one last time, a cry of pure rage and despair. "You can't." The earth beneath Evelyn's feet trembled again, but this time it felt different. The power, the grip of the curse, was slipping away. The air around her began to clear, the weight of the shadows lifting. With the stone broken, the evil force that had anchored the girl to the land began to unravel, its hold weakening. Evelyn stood her ground, her heart hammering in her chest, watching as the girl's form faded into the night. For a long moment, the clearing was silent again, save for the wind rustling through the trees. The forest, once so thick with malevolent energy, now seemed to breathe easier, the oppressive weight lifting from the world. Evelyn's breath was shaky as she stood there, staring at the broken stone. She had done it. She had destroyed the source of the curse, the anchor that had kept it all alive. The girl, the house, the darkness, it was all gone. But Evelyn knew this wasn't just a victory. It was an ending. And with every ending, there was always a price. She felt it then, the emptiness, the hollow space inside of her. The struggle, the fear, the loss. It all came crashing back in a wave, and for a moment, she didn't know if she could take it. But as the night sky above her cleared, as the last traces of the curse finally faded, she realized something. She wasn't alone. The whispers of the souls the house had consumed, the spirits she had freed, she could feel them. Not as shadows or vengeful entities, but as whispers of peace. Gratitude. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt something else too. Hope. The wind rustled around her, not with the heavy malice it once held, but with something gentler. A promise. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that house. She had faced her deepest fears and conquered them. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She took a deep breath and walked away from the ruins of the stone, the girl, and the nightmare that had plagued her for so long. The night was still, but Evelyn was no longer afraid. She was free, and maybe, just maybe, she could finally begin again. Evelyn continued walking, the clearing behind her now swallowed by the silence of the forest. The moonlight still bathed the world in its pale glow, but there was a difference now, a stillness that didn't feel oppressive. The weight that had once been pressing down on her was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The spirits she had freed were no longer lingering in her mind, their voices fading into the distance. But even as the curse had been broken, something tugged at her, a nagging thought that wouldn't let go. What now? She had done the impossible, yes. She had destroyed the heart of the house, freed the trapped souls, and defeated the girl, the embodiment of the house's malevolent force. The journey had been brutal, each moment darker than the last, but it was over. And yet, the question loomed like a shadow in her mind. What was left for her? Her footsteps were soft against the forest floor, but there was a weight to each step now, a hesitation, a reluctance to leave behind everything that had come before. Even with the victory, the sense of finality, the stillness in the air, Evelyn felt lost. The truth was, she didn't know where to go. She had no home to return to. The family she had once known, the life she had once had, seemed so as though it belonged to someone else. The world outside this place was a foreign landscape, one she no longer knew how to navigate. A rustling sound came from behind her, a shift in the air that made her pause. She turned quickly, but the path behind her was empty. The wind had picked up slightly, a chill creeping into the night, but nothing more. Yet the feeling lingered, that sense of being watched, of being followed. She couldn't shake it. Stop it, she scolded herself silently. You've done it. You're free. But freedom wasn't always what it seemed. The thought that something else was waiting just beyond her reach, that the past would forever haunt her, was a shadow she couldn't outrun. Even as the night sky remained calm and quiet, she couldn't escape the sense that the world was shifting around her. Her hand instinctively reached for the small pendant around her neck, the one she had found after the house had collapsed, after everything had crumbled to dust. It was an old, tarnished thing, a simple silver chain with a small charm hanging from it. At first, she had assumed it was just another trinket from the house, a remnant of something long forgotten. But now, she wasn't so sure. She stopped walking, holding the pendant in her hand, studying it closely under the moonlight. There was something odd about it, something familiar. The charm seemed to hum in her palm, a faint vibration that didn't seem possible. The sensation wasn't painful. Rather, it was like the faintest echo of something calling to her, a pulse that resonated deep inside her. Her mind raced, and she felt her chest tighten, as though the ground beneath her was shifting once again. The same feeling she had experienced when she had touched the stone at the heart of the house. She thought desperately, trying to push the thought away. Not this. Not again. But there was no denying it. The power, the energy was still out there. It hadn't been entirely destroyed. Not if the pendant was reacting this way. The girl might have been vanquished, but the source of the evil, the force that had given her life, wasn't gone. It was still alive, lingering, hidden in places she couldn't see. The world itself felt different now, as if something had shifted, opened up, and Evelyn realized, with a chill crawling down her spine, that there were more layers to this curse than she had ever understood. The house had been a mere doorway, a portal into something much darker, far older than she could have imagined. The wind picked up again, this time stronger, and Evelyn shivered as it swept through the trees. The shadows that had once clung to the house now felt like they were stretching toward her. Watching, she looked down at the pendant again, the vibrations growing more intense now, as though it were alive, calling to her. She couldn't explain it. She didn't want to, but she knew she couldn't just walk away. The house, the girl, the curse, had it really been broken? Or was this just the beginning? Without thinking, she pocketed the pendant, a sense of resolve growing within her. There was no turning back now. Evelyn started walking again, her steps more purposeful this time, moving deeper into the woods. It felt like the earth itself was urging her on. There was something out there, something she hadn't yet faced. A presence that had always been there. The true heart of the curse. The deeper she walked, the more the forest seemed to shift around her. The trees bent unnaturally, and the shadows stretched in ways that didn't belong. The air grew colder, and the distant echoes of whispers returned, softer now, but unmistakable. A voice calling her forward. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that she was heading towards something. Something that had been waiting for her. Something that had been watching her since the moment she set foot in that house. And as she ventured deeper, the realization hit her. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about finishing what had been started. About uncovering the truth. The true origin of the curse. The true source of the evil that had haunted this place for centuries. The path ahead was uncertain, and Evelyn didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear, she couldn't walk away. Not now. She wasn't done. Evelyn's footsteps grew heavier as she moved deeper into the forest. The air seemed to thicken, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting in the moonlight like dark, gnarled fingers reaching out toward her. She felt as though she were walking through a nightmare. The forest no longer a natural place, but something alive, breathing with an ancient, unseen presence. The whispers grew louder, not from the trees or the wind, but from somewhere inside her mind. They were soft at first, like the brush of a thought, quiet, barely perceptible. But then they began to intensify, the words becoming clearer. You should turn back. A voice, familiar but distant, seemed to echo in her thoughts. It's not over. You can't stop what's already begun. Evelyn clenched her fists, trying to shake the voice from her mind. She couldn't turn back. She knew she couldn't. The pendant in her pocket pulsed with a rhythmic, steady beat, a faint reminder that she had not yet uncovered all the secrets that lay buried in this forest. She had to find the source. She had to know the truth. Her eyes darted around the dark expanse of trees, her senses heightened. The whispers grew louder still, circling her, pressing in from all sides, until they became a chorus of voices, each one pleading, warning, mocking. You think you freed them? The voice grew louder, more insistent. You think you destroyed it? You haven't even scratched the surface. Her breath caught in her throat. The girl, the one who had haunted the house, the manifestation of the curse, had spoken those words too. You can't destroy what has always been. Evelyn's chest tightened. There was truth in those words, a bitter, haunting truth. She had thought she was finished, that the evil had been exorcised. But there was something more, something much darker. She reached into her pocket and gripped the pendant, feeling the familiar pulse of power against her fingers. It wasn't just a trinket. It was more. She could sense it now, the way it thrummed with an energy that seemed to reach deep into her, pulling at something hidden within her. Her footsteps faltered as the forest around her seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled, reaching out like hands grasping for her. The air felt colder, the ground soft and unstable beneath her feet. And ahead, she could see it, a clearing, dark and unsettling. A soft, ethereal glow emanated from the center, casting a pale light on the ground, but there was something wrong with it. The light was sickly, faint, as if it were struggling to survive. The clearing felt alive, suffocating, like it was holding its breath. Evelyn hesitated at the edge, feeling a sharp pang of fear in her chest. This was it. She could feel it now. The pulse of the curse was strongest here, at the very heart of the forest. As she stepped forward, the whispers rose again, sharper now, almost desperate. Stop. You don't know what you're doing. But she couldn't stop. The need to understand, to face what lay ahead, was too strong. She had come this far. She had fought too hard. The clearing opened up before her, revealing what had been hidden beneath the tangled web of shadows. In the center stood a large stone altar, ancient and worn, cracked in places as if it had been here for centuries. Around it, the ground was marked with strange symbols, symbols that pulsed with the same unnatural energy she had felt when the pendant had hummed in her hand. And in the air above the altar, a figure floated, vague at first, but slowly becoming clearer as Evelyn's eyes adjusted. It was the girl. No, it was the girl's spirit, but there was something else now, something more powerful, more ancient, wrapped around her. Evelyn's heart slammed in her chest as she stepped forward, her eyes widening in recognition. The girl's form flickered, and then her voice, no, the voice of the curse itself, echoed through the clearing. You thought you could break me. You thought you could break this cycle. The voice growled a low, guttural sound, filled with rage and centuries of torment. But you've only awakened it. This has always been my home. This land is mine. It always has been. Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her throat. The realization crashed into her like a tidal wave. The house had never been the origin of the curse. The girl had never been the source of it. The curse had existed long before the house had been built. It was a part of this land, a force that had been buried beneath the earth, waiting for someone, anyone, to awaken it. And now, that someone was her. I am the curse. The voice continued, its tone shifting, its presence growing stronger. I was born from the land. I am its keeper, its protector. This land feeds on fear, on suffering. It always has, and it always will. Evelyn's mind reeled. She had broken the house, destroyed the heart of the curse. But she hadn't understood the true nature of the evil she was up against. It wasn't something that could simply be destroyed. The curse was alive. It was embedded in the very fabric of the land itself. The figure above the altar shifted again, becoming more solid, more defined. The girl's face, twisted with malice, loomed before her, but this time, it was different. This time, Evelyn saw the truth. The girl was a vessel, a mere manifestation of the curse. The true evil had always been here, in the soil, in the roots of the trees, in the bones of the earth itself. And now, it had claimed her. You are mine, the voice hissed. You have freed me, and now you will serve me. You are the new keeper. You will carry my legacy into the world. Evelyn's heart raced, her stomach turning. She understood now. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a savior. She had been chosen, or perhaps cursed, to become part of this dark force. She felt the pull of the land, the darkness seeping into her bones, into her soul. She could feel the power rising within her, trying to take control. The pendant in her pocket pulsed harder now, matching the rhythm of her heartbeat, urging her to embrace the power, to become the new keeper. But deep within her, something resisted. Something pure, something that had survived the darkness. Evelyn clenched her fists, her voice shaking as she forced the words out. No, she wasn't going to give in. She wouldn't be a part of this. Not like the others. With everything she had, she gathered the remnants of her strength and hurled herself toward the altar, toward the center of the curse. She didn't know what would happen next, but she couldn't just stand there and let claim her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the sky above crackling with energy as the curse reacted to her defiance. The darkness roared, trying to swallow her whole. But Evelyn was done running. This time, she would end it for good. Evelyn's body surged forward, propelled by a raw, instinctual need to end this, whatever this was. The power of the curse seemed to grow stronger with each step she took toward the altar, its presence pressing in on her from every direction. The whispers, now maddened with rage, filled her ears, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. The very ground seemed to churn beneath her feet, the roots of the trees snaking toward her like serpents, trying to drag her down. As she neared the altar, the girl's figure flickered again, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. "You can't escape me," the voice whispered, the air growing cold around her. "You are part of me now." Evelyn's fingers brushed against the cold stone of the altar, and an electric jolt shot up her arm. She gasped, the sensation unlike anything she had ever felt. It was as though the stone was alive, pulsing with dark energy beating off her. Her skin burned where it touched, but Evelyn forced herself to keep her hand there. The pendant in her pocket throbbed again, more fiercely now. It felt as though the very air was vibrating with it. She pulled it out, the silver chain burning cold against her palm. The symbol on the pendant, once tarnished and plain, now glowed with an eerie light, the ancient markings coming to life. In that moment, it hit her this wasn't just some trinket. This was the key. "You think the pendant can save you?" The girl's voice screamed, but there was a tremor in it now, as if even she wasn't sure of her own power anymore. "You're already mine. You can't escape." But Evelyn knew this. She knew the key was never just about defeating the girl, never just about breaking the house or the heart. The key was to sever the connection between the curse and the land. She forced the pendant into the air, feeling the pulse of power radiate from it. The whispers in her mind clawed and screamed, but she held firm, raising the pendant higher and higher. The ground rumbled beneath her feet, the ancient stone altar vibrating in response, and she felt a surge of energy unlike anything she had experienced. The force was pulling at her, trying to drag her in, but Evelyn clenched her jaw and focused. She wasn't going to let it win. Not again. "No, stop." The voice shrieked, an agonizing wail of despair and fury that seemed to echo through the very trees. "You cannot break what is mine." But Evelyn could feel it. She could feel the land, the curse, the very essence of the darkness beginning to fracture. She could see it now, the cracks in the earth, the sky itself distorting and warping as the power of the curse began to unravel. With a final defiant cry, Evelyn drove the pendant into the altar. The world seemed to stop. For one brief, suspended moment, everything was still, unnaturally still. The whispers ceased. The air grew heavy with silence, as if the land itself had taken a breath. And then, with an explosion of light and sound, everything shattered. The ground buckled beneath her, the altar cracking open like an ancient tomb, and the figure of the girl, the curse itself, howled, dissolving into 1,000 fractured pieces of shadow and light. The very air around her shimmered, as though reality itself was bending and tearing apart. Evelyn fell to the ground, clutching the pendant in her hand, as the force of the blast knocked her off her feet. The earth seemed to be opening up beneath her, the land groaning in pain, and for a moment, she thought she might be swallowed whole. But then, everything stopped. Silence. It was as though the entire world had held its breath and then let it go. Evelyn sat up slowly, her head spinning. The clearing around her was still, no longer suffocating with darkness. The trees, once twisted and gnarled, now stood tall and strong, bathed in moonlight. The oppressive weight that had filled the air had lifted, and the whispers, the dark energy that had plagued her, were gone. The pendant had stopped glowing. It was just an old, tarnished piece of silver once more. But Evelyn didn't need its power anymore. The curse was over. The land was free. She stood, trembling slightly, and looked around. The clearing was quiet, peaceful even. The air was still, the only sound a soft rustle of leaves in the wind. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn felt light. The weight of the past had finally, truly lifted. The evil was gone. But even as she let out a shaky breath of relief, a small part of her couldn't ignore the lingering thought at the back of her mind. She had defeated the curse, but what about the pieces of herself she had lost along the way? Evelyn looked at her hands, now steady as she held the pendant, and for the first time in a long time, she realized something. The journey, the horror, the terror, it had changed her. But it hadn't broken her. She was free. With one last look around the now peaceful clearing, Evelyn turned and began to walk away from the ruins of the curse. She didn't know what the future held or what awaited her beyond this moment, but she knew one thing for certain. She had faced darkness, and she had come out the other side. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't known in years: hope. As Evelyn walked away from the clearing, the quiet of the night settled around her like a blanket. The chill in the air had lifted, leaving only the crisp scent of damp earth and pine. The forest, once a labyrinth of shadow and terror, now seemed almost welcoming. The oppressive darkness that had once gripped her every step was gone, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the depths of the trees, something ancient and untamed. She stopped, a thought flickering in her mind. Was it truly over? The answer came quickly: no. It couldn't be. The power she had felt, the pull, the whispers, they had all been too strong, too persistent. It wasn't something that could simply vanish overnight. No matter how many battles she won, no matter how many curses she destroyed, Evelyn knew deep in her bones that she would never be able to escape the shadows that followed her. Not entirely, but that didn't mean she couldn't fight them. Her grip tightened around the pendant still clutched in her hand. It was cold now, as though it had lost its purpose, but Evelyn didn't want to let go of it just yet. It was a reminder, a symbol of the battle she'd fought and won, but also of the scars she had left. The curse might have been broken, but its echoes were still there, resonating within her. She had freed the land, the spirits trapped by the curse, and even herself. But was freedom enough? Evelyn's thoughts were interrupted by a soft, rustling sound behind her. She froze, every muscle tensing in alarm. The night air seemed to hold its breath. She was no longer sure if the sense of being watched was real, or if it was just the echo of years spent in terror, constantly expecting something to jump out from the shadows. Her heart raced as she turned slowly, her gaze searching the darkness. Nothing. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. It was nothing. Or was it? The air shifted again, and the rustling sound returned, closer this time. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she scanned the trees. And then she saw it. A figure, a shadow among the trees, just beyond the moonlight's reach. It stood still, unmoving, yet somehow watching. Her pulse quickened as she took a cautious step forward. The figure didn't move, but something in the stillness told her it wasn't human. Her hand instinctively moved to her pocket where the pendant was, but her fingers were met with the chill of emptiness. The pendant was gone. Panic gripped her chest as she searched the ground frantically. Had she dropped it? The figure stepped forward, and Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a person at all. It was a shape, a blur of dark shadow and twisted limbs that seemed to fold into itself with unnatural fluidity. The edges of its form were jagged, like a creature not quite whole, not quite human, but something else. It was wrong. Her mind raced for an explanation, but there was no time. The creature moved, faster than she could react, and with a single swipe of its elongated hand, it knocked Evelyn off her feet, sending her crashing to the forest floor. Pain shot through her body, but Evelyn didn't hesitate. She scrambled back to her feet, her breath ragged, heart pounding in her ears. Her eyes locked on the creature as it circled her, its form shifting and warping like liquid shadows. "You thought it was over," the creature whispered, its voice low and guttural, like the earth itself was speaking. "You think you've destroyed what lies beneath, but it was never about the house, never about the girl. The curse is eternal." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The curse hadn't just been a manifestation tied to the house. It was tied to the land, to something older, deeper, something that had been here long before the house, before the girl. This creature was the true form of the curse. It had been watching her all along. Evelyn's mind raced. She had to think. She had to fight back. She reached for the pendant, but it was still gone. Her fingers dug into the soil, searching for something, anything that could help her. And then she felt it. A shard of broken stone, sharp and jagged, protruding from the ground. Grabbing it with both hands, she swung it at the creature, but it effortlessly sidestepped, its form flickering as if made of smoke. It grinned, a twisted smile forming on what could almost be considered its face. "You cannot fight what is already inside you," it taunted. "You've always been mine, and you always will be." Evelyn's blood ran cold. The words struck deep, and for a moment, doubt seeped into her heart. Had she been wrong? Had she truly destroyed the curse? Or had she just freed it, let it roam free again, more dangerous than ever? The creature lunged at her again, its form writhing, but this time, Evelyn was ready. She reached deep within herself, forcing the fear and doubt aside, focusing on the one thing that had kept her going this far, her will. She gripped the shard of stone tighter, grounding herself in the fact that she wasn't just running from it. She was fighting for something, for herself, for freedom. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth. "Not again." With a final, desperate scream, she plunged the stone shard deep into the creature's form, the jagged edge tearing through the shifting shadow like a knife through cloth. The creature screeched, its form cracking, splintering like glass. For a moment, Evelyn thought it might be over. But then the creature exploded outward in a violent burst of shadow, the force of it knocking her back to the ground. Her vision blurred, her body aching, but she forced herself to her feet once again. The creature's form was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't finished. Not yet. Evelyn turned, her gaze landing on the pendant. It was lying on the ground, just a few feet away from where the creature had been. The pendant glowed faintly again, its power reigniting with a fierce intensity. This wasn't just the pendant's magic. It was hers too. With shaking hands, she picked it up. The whispers from earlier, those voices that had tormented her, had returned, but now they were weaker, quieter. She could feel it now. The pendant wasn't merely a tool for the curse. It was a link, her link to the power of the land, to the darkness she had always been tied to. She wasn't just running away from the curse anymore. She was ready to destroy it once and for all. Evelyn stood tall, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her fingers clutched the pendant, now pulsing with an energy that she could feel in every part of her body. It wasn't just a relic, it was a bridge, a connection, a tether to something she'd never fully understood until now. The creature, though seemingly defeated, wasn't gone. Its dark presence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Its shadow slithered and danced on the edge of her vision, like an insidious nightmare that refused to die. But Evelyn wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had been her constant companion in this journey, but it had no hold on her now. The air around her felt different, like it was alive, charged with an unseen power. The trees around her groaned as if they recognized her new strength, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The creature's voice returned, this time more desperate, more frantic. You think you can control this? You think you can stop it? You're nothing but a part of me, Evelyn. You always have been. The words slithered into her mind like poison, but she didn't flinch. She was no longer the scared girl who had stumbled into this forest. She was something more now, something that had survived the darkness, understood it, and even learned to wield its power. She lifted the pendant, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It had always been tied to her. She could feel that now. But it was more than just a relic. It was a key to unlock the curse that had been embedded in the very land for centuries. It had been passed down through generations, chosen for someone to wield it, and now was hers to command. You're wrong, Evelyn whispered into the silence. I'm not a part of you. I'm something you'll never understand. With a single, focused thought, she pressed the pendant into the earth, grounding herself in the land beneath her feet. The moment it touched the soil, a shockwave of energy surged through the air, rippling outward like a wave across the surface of a still lake. The ground trembled beneath her, but Evelyn stood firm, her eyes glowing with a fierce determination. The shadows that had once hunted her began to recoil, as if the earth itself was rejecting them. The trees creaked and shifted, their branches swaying in a way that felt like the land was waking from a deep, cursed sleep. The creature's shadow screeched in frustration, its form blurring as it writhed in the air. No, you cannot do this. But Evelyn didn't hesitate. She focused all her energy into the pendant, pushing her will into it, channeling everything she had learned about the curse, the darkness, the power, the fear. It was all part of her now, and she wasn't afraid to use it. With a cry, she yanked the pendant from the earth and held it high above her head, its light now blazing like a beacon in the night. The darkness around her surged, but this time, it couldn't stop the power that was coursing through her veins. It couldn't compete with her strength. The creature's form flickered again, but this time, it began to unravel, its edges dissolving into the air like smoke. It screeched, louder than before, its voice filled with rage and agony. You think you can rid the world of me? I don't just want to rid the world of you, Evelyn said, her voice steady and strong. I want to break your hold on this land. I want to make it mine. The land beneath her began to crack, the earth splitting apart as the darkness was torn away. The trees trembled, their roots lifting from the ground, no longer chained to the curse. The very air shimmered with energy as the forest began to come alive, shedding the weight of centuries of torment. The creature's form shrank, twisting, its power fading as Evelyn's strength continued to rise. The pendant began to glow brighter, its light blinding, until the shadow was nothing more than a faint whisper in the wind. And then, with one final, deafening cry, the curse shattered. The creature's shadow collapsed in on itself, evaporating into nothingness, leaving only the quiet hum of the earth around Evelyn. She stood alone in the clearing, the weight of what she had just done crashing over her. Her body trembled, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, but she couldn't let herself fall. Not now. The forest was still, the oppressive weight of the curse finally lifted. The trees, once twisted and gnarled, were now whole again, standing tall against the night sky. The air felt fresh, the oppressive darkness gone, leaving behind the peaceful quiet of a world freed from its ancient torment. Evelyn looked down at the pendant in her hand, now glowing faintly, but no longer pulsing with the intensity it had before. It was just a relic, a symbol of the battle she had fought, the battle she had won. But was more than that, too. It was a reminder. She had survived. She had won. And for the first time since she had stepped into this forest, she felt the weight of the past fall away. She had been bound by the curse, tied to it in ways she didn't fully understand, but now she was free. The darkness that had consumed her life for so long was no more. With a final glance at the now peaceful clearing, Evelyn turned and began to walk away from the forest. It was time to leave the shadows behind, time to move on from the past. The world was hers now, and whatever lay ahead, she was ready for it. As Evelyn walked away from the clearing, she felt the weight of the pendant growing lighter in her hand. The oppressive tension that had once followed her like a dark cloud was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The cool night air, once thick with the whispers of the curse, now felt refreshing against her skin. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn didn't feel the familiar tug of dread in the pit of her stomach. But even as she walked, a small, nagging feeling remained, one she didn't quite shake. There was a quiet voice in the back of her mind, telling her that the end of the curse wasn't the end of her story. And she was right to listen to it. As the trees began to thin, the forest opening up to reveal the familiar path she had walked on her way in, Evelyn noticed something odd. The shadows in the distance, just beyond the tree line, seemed to be shifting, not in a natural way, but in a way that seemed deliberate, as if they were alive. Her pulse quickened. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat, unsure if it was just a lingering aftereffect of the curse or something more. Her eyes scanned the forest, but nothing moved. Nothing jumped out at her, but the feeling remained. She reached for the pendant again, her fingers brushing against the cool surface, grounding herself. This time, the pendant didn't hum with power. It didn't glow. It felt empty. Then the ground beneath her feet trembled. Not violently, but enough to make her pause, to make her heart skip a beat. She looked down at her feet. The earth was undisturbed, but the tremor felt like it came from deep within the land, as if something buried far beneath her was waking up. Her thoughts raced. What was that? Was the curse really gone, or had it only been temporarily silenced? Was there something deeper at work here? Something that even the pendant couldn't destroy? A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the woods. It wasn't the wind or an animal. No, this sound felt wrong, unnatural. And then she heard it. A voice. Evelyn. It called low and distant, but unmistakable. The voice was both familiar and foreign, twisted and jagged, as though it had been stretched out of something ancient, something primal. Evelyn's breath hitched. Not again. She had already faced the curse, broken it. She had freed herself from the torment. She couldn't be pulled back into it. She turned in the direction of the voice, her heart pounding. But there was nothing in the darkness. Just shadows, stretching endlessly, flickering in the dim light. Evelyn. The voice was clearer now, closer, unmistakably real. It seemed to come from all directions at once, wrapping around her like tendrils of smoke. The earth continued to tremble, the ground shifting beneath her feet, and a sense of vertigo washed over her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shape. It was standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the dark foliage. It looked like a person, but not quite. The edges of the figure blurred, as if it were made of shadows itself. And yet, as Evelyn's eyes adjusted, she could see something else. It was a shape, a silhouette that seemed to be pulling the light around it, warping it. Come closer, the voice beckoned, and this time, Evelyn couldn't help herself. She took a step forward, then another. Her body felt heavy, like she was being drawn in by an invisible force. She wanted to stop, but the pull was too strong. You can't run from what you are, the voice whispered, now clear and sharp, as though it had been waiting for this moment. You were never free, Evelyn. The curse isn't just in the land. It's in you. Evelyn froze. The words wrapped around her, tightening with each syllable. She felt as though the world around her was closing in. The darkness, those shadows, that voice, were reaching into her mind, pulling at something deep within. The pendant in her hand flickered, its light dimming. No longer was it a beacon of power. Now, it felt like a relic, one that had served its purpose and was useless in the face of the growing darkness. "No," Evelyn whispered, backing away. "No, I broke it. I ended it." "Did you?" The voice was cold, mocking. And as the figure stepped into the moonlight, Evelyn's heart sank. It was the girl, or something that resembled her. The girl from the clearing. The one who had haunted the house, who had twisted the land into a web of darkness. Her face was pale, eyes hollow, as though she were nothing more than a shadow of what had once been human. Her features were distorted, jagged, the lines of her face broken and reshaped in unnatural ways. She was no longer the girl Evelyn had fought. She was something worse. "You've only made me stronger," the girl whispered, her voice echoing in Evelyn's ears. "Now, you're the key, Evelyn. The curse is not over. It was never about me. It was about you. And now that I've found you again, you will never be free." Evelyn's mind raced, every thought crashing into the next. She had been so sure, so certain that the curse had ended, that she had freed the land. But the truth was worse than she could have imagined. The curse wasn't something that could be broken by force. It wasn't just an evil that plagued a house. It was inside her, woven into the very fibers of her being, tied to something ancient and beyond her comprehension. The girl's form shimmered in the shadows, her broken smile stretching wider. "You will always carry the curse," she said, her voice now a cruel, guttural laugh. "Forever." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the pendant, the last vestige of power she had left. She wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. With a deep breath, she prepared herself for what would come next. If she couldn't break the curse, maybe, just maybe, she could change its rules. Maybe it was time to stop running. Time to face whatever she had become. And with that thought, Evelyn made her choice. Evelyn stood rooted in place, the chilling voice of the girl ringing in her ears. But beneath the fear, beneath the overwhelming sense of doom, something else stirred, a spark, a glimmer of defiance. She wasn't going to let this thing, this curse, consume her. Not after everything she had endured. The figure of the girl, her shadowy, broken form, hovered in the moonlight, a grotesque reflection of the spirit that had once haunted the land. Her smile was too wide, too cruel, as if she had known this moment would come. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something deep in the earth itself, the very thing that had bound Evelyn to the curse all these years. But Evelyn's mind wasn't on the girl anymore. Her eyes were locked on the pendant, now cold and dim, but still grasped firmly in her hand. The power it had once held, the power she had thought was a gift, had turned into a reminder of her entrapment. She wasn't sure how she'd broken the curse the first time, but she was certain of one thing now. The pendant had only been a piece of the puzzle. The curse had always been about more than just the land, more than just the girl. It had always been tied to her, and she couldn't just destroy it. Evelyn's fingers curled around the pendant, her grip tightening. The girl laughed again, a hollow, echoing sound that chilled Evelyn to the core. "You still don't understand, do you?" "No," Evelyn replied, her voice shaking at first but gaining strength with each word. "I understand more than you think." The shadows that surrounded them seemed to recoil at her words, flickering as if uncertain. The air felt heavy, the land itself seeming to hold its breath. She took a step forward, the tremors in the earth beneath her feet still pulsing but growing weaker now. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "This curse isn't about keeping me bound to the earth," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "It's about making me believe that it has power over me. But I've learned. I am the curse, and I choose to let it go." The girl's twisted form flinched, the smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Evelyn felt it, the moment of doubt that rippled through the dark figure. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Evelyn shook her head. "I'm not walking away. I'm ending this. Right now. The pendant flared in her hand, its dim light now pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The shadows in the forest twisted, the land itself seemingly reacting to the force she was channeling through it. There was a rumble in the earth, a deep, unsettling sound, as if the curse itself was fighting to hold onto its power. But Evelyn fought harder. The pendant wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol. And for the first time, she realized that the true power lay not in the pendant, but in her. She had always carried the curse within her, but she also carried the strength to break it. The girl recoiled, her form flickering as though she couldn't bear the force that was now flowing from Evelyn. "No," she whispered, a crack of desperation in her voice. You can't undo what's been done." "Watch me," Evelyn replied, her voice cold and resolute. With one final, sharp exhale, she thrust the pendant into the ground once more. The earth groaned beneath her, but this time it was different. The ground seemed to tremble not in fear, but in recognition. The land itself knew that it was time to be free. The darkness, the curse, the shadows, all of it began to unravel. The earth cracked wide open, and a surge of light shot up from the very core of the land, bright and blinding. The girl screamed, but it was a sound full of anguish, full of something breaking. She stretched her hands out toward Evelyn, but the shadows that had once defined her began to melt, dissolving into the air like smoke. The light from the pendant intensified, its glow washing over everything, over the girl, over the forest, over Evelyn herself. The shadows retreated, dissolving into nothingness as the light consumed them. The land that had been so twisted and dark for so long began to heal, the weight of the curse finally lifting. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light faded. The air grew still, and the earth settled into a deep, tranquil silence. The girl, the shadow, was gone, and with her the curse. Evelyn stood in the clearing, panting, her body trembling from the exertion. She felt as though she had just fought a battle, one that had torn her apart and put her back together again. She could feel the remnants of the curse lingering in the air, but it was weak now, fading with every breath she took. The land around her, once shrouded in darkness, was now calm and peaceful. The trees stood tall and proud, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. The pendant in her hand was warm now, its glow finally extinguished, leaving it as nothing more than a relic once more. She held it up to her eyes, staring at its intricate design. She had never truly understood its power until now. But as she stood there in the silence, she realized that she didn't need it anymore. She didn't need anything from the past. Evelyn turned her back on the clearing and started to walk away, the weight in her chest finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. The curse was over. It was gone. But as she walked, the faintest of whispers brushed against her ear, soft, insistent. She turned quickly, her heart leaping in her chest. But there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, just the stillness of the forest. The whispers faded. It was over. For real this time. Evelyn took a steadying breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. Every step she took felt lighter, as if the weight of 1,000 unseen chains had finally snapped. The forest, once a place of nightmares and twisted horrors, now seemed almost serene. The trees whispered in the wind, their leaves soft and gentle, no longer filled with the dark murmurs of something lurking just beneath the surface. And yet, even as she walked away from the clearing, there was a small, nagging feeling, a pull in the back of her mind. The whispers she had heard, the ones that had just faded away, seemed to have lingered in the air, like a faint echo of something she couldn't quite grasp. She shook her head, trying to push it aside. It was nothing. The curse was over. The land was free. She had won. But as she reached the edge of the forest, where the dense trees began to thin out, the feeling grew stronger, more insistent. It wasn't the same voice as before, but it was undeniably there, a faint sound carried by the wind. Evelyn. The whisper came again, so quiet that it could almost be mistaken for the rustling of leaves. But Evelyn's heart stuttered in her chest, a cold shiver running down her spine. She stopped in her tracks. The forest around her had fallen into an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to still. The shadows at the edge of the trees flickered unnaturally, bending and twisting as if they were alive, waiting, watching. No, she couldn't let this happen again. Evelyn. The voice was clearer now. Not a whisper, but a soft, soothing murmur, just loud enough for her to hear. The same voice that had haunted her before, but now it carried a different tone, calm, almost affectionate. It felt wrong. It felt like it was inside her, like it was seeping into her thoughts, making her doubt herself. You can't run from what you are, the voice cooed, and Evelyn felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. You are the curse. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The clearing she had just left was empty, the moonlight casting long, stretching shadows across the forest floor. But she felt it. Something was waiting. Something had been waiting all along. You can't escape it, the voice said again, this time not from the shadows, but from within her own mind. It wasn't just words, it was an idea, a feeling and knowing, like a memory that wasn't her own. The curse is not just tied to the land, it is tied to you. It has always been inside of you, and always will be. Evelyn's pulse quickened. No, this couldn't be real. She had destroyed it. She had ended it. She stumbled backward, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had she truly freed herself? Or was this all just an illusion? Had the curse been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to believe she had won, so it could drag her back in? Her fingers tightened around the pendant in her hand. But now, it felt cold and hollow, no longer a source of strength, but an anchor that tied her to something she couldn't see, something she couldn't control. The voice continued, relentless, pushing deeper into her mind. You were always the vessel, Evelyn. You think the curse is something you can break? No, it's something you become. It always has been, and now you're mine again. The world around her began to warp, the trees warping into strange, contorted shapes, the ground cracking and twisting as the forest seemed to bend under the weight of her thoughts. Evelyn stumbled again, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, louder than anything else. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. I won't let it. I won't be your vessel. But the words felt weak in her mouth, as though they had been spoken by someone else. A dark, swirling mist began to crawl toward her from all sides, creeping along the forest floor like a sentient thing. It slithered, reached out with fingers that seemed to melt into the shadows, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The mist began to rise, thickening around her, suffocating her in its grasp. You are the curse, Evelyn. You always were. And just when she thought she couldn't take another step, when she thought she might lose herself in the darkness, a burst of light erupted from the pendant in her hand. It was blinding, so bright that it cut through the mist like a knife through fog. The mist recoiled, hissing as if in pain. Evelyn's grip on the pendant tightened. She had felt this power before. She had used it before. And now, in this moment, it was the only thing standing between her and the crushing weight of the curse that was creeping back in her life. With a cry, she thrust the pendant forward toward the heart of the swirling darkness. No, the voice screamed, this time filled with terror, as if it could sense its end. You can't. But the light from the pendant grew, expanding, filling the entire clearing. The ground shook violently beneath her feet. The trees groaned and twisted, but now they were not enemies. They were allies, helping her fight back. And just as the voice reached its highest pitch, as the last remnants of the curse were drawn into the light, there was silence. The air cleared. The mist dissipated. Evelyn stood alone, the forest calm around her. The world had stopped moving, the oppressive darkness gone. She felt it then. The weight was truly lifted. There was no more shadow, no more voice in her mind, no more curse. For the first time, Evelyn felt nothing but the vast, quiet emptiness of the night. It was over. Finally. But even as she began to walk again, as the path ahead remained clear, a small, strange thought lingered in her mind. What if the curse wasn't something that could be broken? What if it was always part of her? She pushed the thought away. For now, at least. The road was long, and she was free, at least for the moment. As Evelyn walked deeper into the forest, the quiet stretched on like a thin sheet of glass, fragile and unbroken. The night felt different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence that had smothered her before. This felt peaceful. The moonlight filtered through the trees in soft beams, and the distant sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, the chirp of crickets, seemed to reassure her that the worst was over. But a nagging thought still lingered in the back of her mind, like a ghost in the corner of her consciousness, too persistent to ignore. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, that she hadn't truly finished the battle. The curse has always been a part of you. The words from the voice echoed in her mind, repeating over and over again. No matter how hard she tried to push them away, they stuck to her thoughts like wet leaves to skin. The voice wasn't gone, not entirely. She had felt its grip loosen, but it hadn't released her. And that scared her. She glanced down at the pendant in her hand again. It had stopped glowing, its power dissipated, but it still felt alive, as though it was waiting for something. She had used it to break the curse before, but now it seemed like an object in transition, like it still had a part to play. Suddenly, the air around her grew colder. She paused, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Then she heard it, a sound in the distance. It was faint at first, like the creaking of old wood, but then it grew louder, closer. A low, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath her feet. It was the sound of something ancient, something powerful, stirring beneath the earth. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She had thought it was over. She had felt it end. But now, she wasn't so sure. The rumbling intensified, and the ground beneath her shifted again, a deep tremor running through the forest floor, strong enough to make her stumble. She gripped the pendant tighter, her knuckles white. The forest around her began to darken. The trees seemed to bend and warp, their branches twisting as though caught in an invisible wind. The voice from before returned, not a whisper, but a guttural growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. You can't outrun what's inside you, Evelyn. Evelyn's heart thudded painfully in her chest. The curse hadn't been broken. It had only shifted, like a parasite finding a new host. She had thought that by confronting the girl, the source of the curse, she had won. But now, she realized the truth. The curse wasn't just a malevolent force. It wasn't something that could be defeated. It was her, a part of her, from the moment she had first encountered it, woven into the very fabric of her being. The rumbling grew louder, now accompanied by an unsettling sound, a low, humming vibration that felt like it was seeping into her bones. The trees began to shake, their branches creaking as if the entire forest was about to collapse inward. Evelyn stumbled backward, her gaze snapping around the clearing. Shadows stretched across the ground, swirling and writhing, reaching toward her like dark tendrils. It was coming for her. The curse, her curse, was waking up again. And this time, it wasn't just trying to take her. It was demanding her. With trembling hands, Evelyn raised the pendant before her, the last thread of power she had left. The air crackled with energy, but it wasn't the same as before. The pendant felt heavy now, as though it were resisting her touch, as though it recognized that the time for its power to work in her favor had passed. She wasn't sure what it was doing anymore, if it was even capable of stopping what was coming. "You can't escape me," the voice said again, But this time it wasn't just in her mind. It was in the earth itself, in the wind that howled through the trees. The sound was omnipresent, vibrating through her very soul. You were never meant to defeat me. You were meant to become me. Evelyn's legs wobbled, and she fell to her knees in the dirt. The pendant slipped from her grasp and rolled to the ground, its light dimming further until it seemed to lose all power. The ground cracked open beneath her, wide fissures forming in the earth like jagged wounds. A figure began to rise from the depths, dark and formless, its shape shifting with each passing moment. A shadow of a shadow, made of nightmares and things that had never existed in the light. Evelyn tried to scramble backward, but the ground beneath her gave way, sending her tumbling into the darkness below. For a moment, everything went black, and then the figure loomed over her, filling the space with its overwhelming presence. It was like an absence, a void, a thing that didn't belong to the world. Evelyn could barely make out its features, but she knew, deep in her bones, that it was the true form of the curse. This wasn't just a spirit. It was an entity, a force as old as the earth itself, a creature that lived in the shadows, feeding on fear and despair. "You cannot fight me," it whispered, its voice no longer human. "You never could." Evelyn's heart raced. She couldn't escape it. The land, the forest, the curse, they were all one. They were her. But there was one thing the curse hadn't counted on. It had never accounted for Evelyn's choice. And as the shadow reached toward her, as the world threatened to swallow her whole, Evelyn reached inside herself. She had thought the curse had been broken, but the truth was she had never truly been freed. The curse wasn't something she could fight. It wasn't something she could destroy. It was something she had to control. And with that understanding, she grasped the darkness and pulled it into herself. The ground trembled violently as the forest screamed in protest. The air crackled with energy, and for the briefest of moments, the world held its breath. And then silence. A deep, unyielding silence. Evelyn opened her eyes. The forest was still. The ground was whole again, no cracks, no tremors. The dark figure was gone, swallowed up by her own mind. She could feel it there, quiet, contained, dormant, but it was no longer in control. She had become it. Evelyn stood, breathless and trembling, but a sense of power surged through her veins, the strength of the curse now hers to wield. For better or worse, the curse had never left. It had always been a part of her. And now Evelyn understood. She wasn't its victim. She was its keeper, and she would never be free. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a terrible thing. Evelyn stood motionless in the heart of the forest, the weight of the curse, her curse, now settled deep within her bones. The air around her felt thicker, the world seeming to hold its breath. She felt different, changed, as if a part of her had shifted, fused with something ancient and untamable. The dark entity that had once threatened to swallow her whole now lived within her, dormant but always there, like a sleeping beast waiting to stir. For a moment, she could feel the pulse of the forest, the hum of its energy beneath her feet, as though it recognized the new balance. The trees, once ominous and twisted, now seemed to breathe alongside her, their leaves rustling in the night air. The whispers that had once driven her mad now fell silent, as if acknowledging that she, too, was part of the land, part of the curse. She swallowed hard, the reality of it settling into her mind. The curse had never truly been about breaking free from it. She wasn't meant to destroy it. No, she was meant to embrace it. She was the keeper of this land, the one who walked the fine line between the living and the dead, between the light and the darkness. "You cannot fight me." The voice echoed in her mind once more, but it wasn't threatening anymore. It was content. "You are me." Evelyn closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She could feel it now, like an extension of herself, a presence that at first had terrified her, but now was something she could hold in her grasp. She understood it. She understood that this darkness, this curse, was not just an external force. It was a part of her, a part of the land, a part of the cycle of life and death. And now, she was its guardian. But with that power came responsibility. The curse was no longer something that haunted her in the shadows. It was something she had to control. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to keep it contained. The weight of the pendant still lingered in her palm, its warmth now more of a reminder than a source of power. She glanced at it again, its glow completely gone, yet its influence was still felt. Suddenly, a rustle in the trees snapped her out of her thoughts. The sound was soft, almost cautious. Someone, or something, was near. Evelyn tensed, every muscle in her body alert. The forest had always been her refuge, but now it felt more like a prison, the dark energy within her twisting in response to the unknown presence. The whispers in her mind grew louder again, but she suppressed them, focusing on the sound. A figure emerged from the trees. A man, cloaked in shadow, his face obscured by a hood. He was tall, but there was a strange stillness to his movement, as though he was part of the forest itself. Evelyn's breath caught. She had never seen him before, but something about him felt familiar. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice calm, low, but not without an edge. "I knew you couldn't escape what you are." Evelyn narrowed her eyes, her hand instinctively reaching for the pendant, but the presence inside her stirred. It wanted to break free. It wanted to claim this new arrival. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. The man stepped closer, his eyes gleaming faintly in the darkness. There was a glint of recognition in his gaze, but it wasn't one she could place. She had never seen him before, and yet, it was as though he had been waiting for her. "It doesn't matter who I am," he replied cryptically. "What matters is what you become, what you've always been." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. "You think you've won, don't you?" The man's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think you've contained the curse, sealed it away. But the truth is, Evelyn, you are the curse. You always have been." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Evelyn's grip on the pendant tightened, but she no longer felt the pull of its power. The figure before her was something else, something that seemed to understand the nature of the curse in a way she hadn't yet fully grasped. "No," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I chose to contain it. I chose to control it. I'm not a prisoner anymore." The man's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with something she couldn't place, something dangerous. "You haven't contained it, Evelyn. You've merely awakened it. It's only a matter of time before the curse consumes you, and when it does, there will be nothing left of you. Nothing but shadows and ashes." Evelyn took a step back, feeling the weight of his words. She had thought she had mastered the curse, that she had come to terms with it. But now, with this man standing before her, her confidence wavered. He knew something she didn't. "Who are you?" she repeated, more forcefully this time, her voice cutting through the tension between them. "What do you want from me?" The man's smile softened, but it was no less unsettling. "I want nothing from you, Evelyn. I just want you to see the truth." Evelyn stood her ground, shaking her head. She wouldn't let him break her. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. "The curse is mine to control," she said, her voice stronger than before. "And I will keep it contained. No one else will suffer from it. Not again." The man's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with something unreadable. "We'll see about that." In an instant, the air around them seemed to shift. The wind picked up, swirling through the trees, and the shadows around them deepened. Evelyn felt the curse stirring within her again, its presence like a low hum beneath her skin, trying to break free. The man reached into his cloak and drew something out. A small, obsidian dagger, its blade reflecting the dim moonlight in a way that made Evelyn's stomach twist. She didn't know why. but she could feel the danger radiating from it. It was an object of power, and it wasn't just for show. You think you can control the curse, but you're just one piece in a much larger game, the man said, his voice low and steady. And pieces like you, pieces like us, never last long. Evelyn took a step back, but her body was already shaking with the power now thrumming beneath her skin. She could feel the dark energy pushing against her, testing her resolve. She had to remain calm. She had to remain in control. She reached into the very core of herself, tapping into the strength she had discovered earlier. But this time, there was something different, a whisper, an urge, something dark and ancient, urging her to let go. Evelyn, the man said, his voice a soft, dangerous murmur. It's already begun. The curse has always been a part of you, and now it's time to let it take you. And Evelyn realized, with a sickening clarity, that he was right. She had never truly been free. Not now. Not ever. And as the world around her began to blur, the curse rising inside her like a storm, she realized that the battle was only just beginning. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as the curse surged inside her, raw and untamed. She could feel it rippling through her veins, filling her mind with images of destruction, of things torn apart, of everything she had fought to contain slipping through her fingers. The man before her was right about one thing: she was no longer free. But what he didn't understand was that she wasn't powerless either. She was the curse, but that meant she was the one who held its reins. As the wind picked up, swirling around them in violent gusts, Evelyn's gaze never left the man. His expression was one of quiet satisfaction, as if he were waiting for her to break, waiting for her to lose control. But she wouldn't let him have that victory. Not now. She steadied herself, drawing in a deep breath, feeling the weight of the curse within her and channeling it, pulling it into a focus she hadn't fully known she possessed. The energy felt like fire in her chest, like molten lava, but it wasn't out of control. Not yet. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of doubt deep inside. She couldn't let it show. Not now. She was stronger than this. The man's smile deepened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes now, something almost like pity. You don't understand, do you? He asked, his voice dripping with calm malice. You think you're in control, but you're not. Not yet. Evelyn's hands trembled as the curse writhed inside her, demanding release. The shadows in the forest around them grew thicker, closer, their twisting forms bending toward her as though drawn to her very soul. The trees groaned under the pressure of the dark energy swelling beneath her skin. You can't fight fate, the man continued. No one can. The curse will claim you, just like it claimed all the others before you. Evelyn shook her head. I'm not like the others, she replied fiercely, her breath shallow but controlled. I won't let it destroy me. I'll use it. I'll be its keeper. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in the man's eyes, something that almost resembled admiration, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. You can never control it, Evelyn. It's a force beyond anything you've ever known, and it will tear you apart from the inside. He stepped closer, the obsidian dagger gleaming in his hand. You're already feeling it, aren't you? The darkness pulling at the edges of your mind, the cold hands that reach into your soul. It wants you to give in. It wants to consume you. Evelyn clenched her fists, the curse writhing inside her like a living thing, but she held it at bay. She could feel it, yes. She could feel the desire to let go, to give in to the darkness. It was intoxicating, but she wouldn't. She couldn't. I can control it, she repeated, louder now, her voice firm with the weight of her conviction. And I won't let it control me. The man laughed, a soft, mocking sound that reverberated through the air. Control? He asked, his tone suddenly cold, detached. That's the lie it wants you to believe. The curse isn't something to be controlled. It's something to be embraced, something to become. Evelyn's stomach churned at the thought. He was right about one thing. She had embraced it. She had let it into her. But what he didn't understand was that she had never let go of the reins. She was still the one in control, no matter how much the curse whispered in her ear. The wind picked up again, now howling with a strange, unnatural intensity. The trees around them began to twist and bend, the shadows crawling along the ground toward her, as if drawn to her power. Evelyn raised her hands, focusing all her will into them. The curse inside her responded with a violent surge, but she held it back, feeling its pressure, its need to escape. She could feel the darkness reaching for her, urging her to release it, to let it take over. But she wouldn't. Not yet. She let out a steady breath, closing her eyes for a moment as she centered herself. The curse was a part of her, yes, but it was not her. It was an extension of herself, an ancient force that she had learned to live with. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to fight it. She wasn't going to try to destroy it. She was going to use it. The energy around her shifted. The curse, now awake and aware, surged beneath her skin, but this time, it was different. She wasn't fighting it. She was commanding it. The man's eyes widened, a flash of something. Fear? Crossing his face. No, he whispered, his voice strained. You can, but it was too late. Evelyn had already reached out, embracing the curse, not as a victim, but as a master. The shadows swirled around her, twisting and writhing as though they were alive. The wind howled in her ears, but she didn't flinch. She became the wind, the storm, the shadow. She became the curse itself. The dagger in the man's hand trembled as if it recognized the shift in the balance of power. Evelyn could feel its pull, an ancient, dark magic that sought to control, to break her. But it was no longer a threat. It was just another tool, a tool she could wield. You think you can control this power? The man asked, his voice now tinged with disbelief. You think you can tame it? Evelyn opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on him. I'm the curse, she said, her voice carrying an eerie calm. And I will not be its slave. I will not be anyone's slave. The forest around them shuddered, the trees groaning as if they, too, were caught in the swirling tide of dark energy. The man took a step back, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and frustration. You will fail, he spat, the dagger now trembling in his grip. You can never escape what you are. But Evelyn only smiled, her fingers crackling with energy as she drew the darkness closer. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had accepted what she was, and in doing so, she had found her strength. We'll see about that, she said softly, her voice like a whisper of wind. This curse, it will not consume me. I will become it. With a sudden motion, she thrust her hand forward, sending a burst of dark energy crashing toward the man. The force of it knocked him backward, his dagger slipping from his hand as the shadows enveloped him. He struggled, but it was no use. The curse had already claimed him. For the first time, Evelyn felt the full extent of the power that had been building inside her. The curse, the darkness, it was no longer something that haunted her. It was something she had mastered, and she would use it to protect the world from itself. The man's form twisted and disappeared into the shadows, swallowed whole by the very force he had tried to control. Evelyn stood alone in the clearing, the weight of the curse heavy in her chest, but now she understood it. She was the curse, and now it was hers to command. The world would never be the same, but neither would she. And that, she realized with a flicker of grim satisfaction, was exactly how it was meant to be. Evelyn stood in the aftermath, the remnants of the dark energy still swirling around her like an electric storm. The echoes of her victory resonated through the forest, the very air trembling with the power she had just wielded. The trees, once so twisted and alive with ancient magic, now felt different, silent, as if they were waiting for her next move, acknowledging her as their new master. But the power was intoxicating, and she had to remain grounded. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The man was gone, dissolved into the shadows, his body consumed by the curse he had tried so desperately to control. But even his disappearance didn't give her peace. It only raised more questions. She looked down at her hands, still crackling with residual energy. The pulse of the curse inside her, now settled beneath the surface, throbbed gently, a reminder that she hadn't just defeated a threat. She had become something new, something beyond human. She had crossed a threshold she couldn't go back from. She was both the curse and the keeper, a living paradox. A low, unsettling sound broke the stillness of the night, a whisper, but not the kind that came from the trees. This whisper felt like it was coming from deep within her, from the very marrow of her bones, an ancient voice she couldn't ignore. You've done it, Evelyn. You've embraced the darkness. But do you understand what that means? The voice was familiar, but not in a comforting way. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the beginning, when she first found the pendant. The same voice that had haunted her, urging her toward destruction. But now, it wasn't as terrifying. It was something else more like a guide than a threat. I understand, she said aloud, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. The curse is part of me. It's part of everything, and I will not be its victim. The voice seemed to pause, then continued, the words slow, deliberate. You think you were its master, but you are a puppet, Evelyn, just like all the others before you. You were meant to fall, just as they did. Evelyn clenched her fists, feeling the power surge inside her. The voice wanted her to break. It wanted her to doubt herself, to give in to the fear it was trying to sow in her heart. But she wouldn't let it. Not now. I'm not afraid anymore, she said, her voice firm, almost daring the voice to respond. There was a long silence, the world around her still and heavy. Then, the voice returned, quieter, more resigned. Then you will see what comes next. But know this, Evelyn, the curse is never satisfied. It will always hunger for more. The darkness within her stirred, but she was ready for it. She had always known this, deep down. The curse was not something that could be defeated or banished. It was something that had always existed, a part of the world's ancient fabric. But she could control it. She could bend it to her will. And she would protect the world from the chaos it could unleash. With a deep breath, Evelyn began to walk forward, the shadows parting in her wake as though they too acknowledged her dominance. The forest, once a place of fear and confusion, now seemed to bend around her. The trees whispered to her, not in fear, but in reverence. The journey ahead would not be easy. She could feel the weight of the curse, still hungry, still demanding. But Evelyn knew she was strong enough now. Strong enough to hold it in check. She was not the same woman who had wandered into these woods, terrified of the power she'd unleashed. She was its keeper now. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the world below. The air was thick with magic, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, guarding the path ahead. Evelyn walked onward, the echoes of the forest blending with her own heartbeat, steady and strong. There was no turning back now. There never had been. The curse was hers, and she would use it. And as the shadows deepened around her, she realized that she wasn't just protecting the world from the curse. She was protecting the world from herself. The night stretched on, the forest growing darker, the weight of the curse settling deeper into her bones. But Evelyn didn't fear it. She had embraced it. And now, with every step she took, she became something more, a force of nature, the living manifestation of the power she had once fought so desperately to escape. And whatever came next, she would face it, as the keeper, as the curse, and she would never again be its prisoner. The path through the forest seemed endless, the shadows pressing in closer with each step Evelyn took. The trees, once welcoming, now felt more like walls closing in around her, as if the forest itself was aware of her transformation. The wind whispered in her ears, teasing her thoughts, pulling at the darkness within her, reminding her of what she had become. She paused at the edge of a clearing, her senses heightened, feeling the pull of something distant, something deeper in the forest. She had no idea where the path would lead her, but she felt a compulsion to keep moving. It was as though the curse was guiding her, tugging at her very core, telling her to go further. But Evelyn didn't know if she was following the forest's will or her own. She had never felt this disconnected from her human self before. There were moments when the power inside her felt alien, like a force she could barely control. Yet, with every moment, it felt more and more like a part of her. She stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath her feet soft with moss and fallen leaves. The moonlight filtered down through the canopy above, casting long, twisted shadows on the earth. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw what stood in the center of the clearing. A stone altar. It was old, ancient even, covered in moss and creeping vines, as if the forest itself had claimed it. But there was something about it that seemed familiar, something that tugged at the deepest corners of her mind, as though she had seen it before in her dreams. Or perhaps in her nightmares. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her toward the altar, as if it were waiting for her, calling her by name. She knew she had to approach, but there was a chill in the air, a coldness that seemed to radiate from the stone. Taking a steadying breath, Evelyn moved forward, her footsteps slow and deliberate. As she reached the altar, she placed her hand on the stone. It was cold to the touch, the surface rough and weathered by centuries of time. But as her fingers brushed against the surface, a sudden surge of energy shot through her, like an electric shock, making her body tremble. "This is it," the voice inside her whispered. "This is where it all began. This is where you must decide." Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to focus on the words, trying to make sense of the flood of emotions and visions that threatened to overwhelm her. The power inside her roared, pushing her toward the altar as if it had a life of its own. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something older than the forest itself. A presence that was part of her now, a force that had been waiting for her. The air grew thick with magic, and Evelyn knew, with a terrible certainty, that this moment was the turning point. The curse had always been a part of the forest, and the forest had always been a part of the curse. She was the bridge between them, the keeper of both. But there was something else, something dark and twisted, something more than just the curse itself. She could feel it stirring beneath her skin, a power that wasn't just ancient, but primal. The voice inside her was growing louder, almost pleading. "You cannot control it forever, Evelyn. The darkness will claim you. It will make you its own." Evelyn's fingers dug into the stone, her nails scraping against the cold surface. The energy within her surged, violent and raw, but she held onto it, forcing it back. She wasn't going to let it win. Not now. Not ever. "I won't let it take me," she whispered aloud, her voice strained. "I won't become what it wants me to be." The ground beneath her feet trembled. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the branches, and for a moment, Evelyn felt as though the very earth was shifting beneath her. The shadows around her seemed to writhe, as if alive, coiling and uncoiling in the moonlight. And then, in a single, horrifying instant, the altar cracked. The stone split down the center with a deafening roar, and from within the broken stone, something began to emerge. A figure, tall and skeletal, its face hidden in the dark folds of its cloak, its form barely more than a shadow, yet it exuded a suffocating power. Evelyn could feel its presence pressing against her, pushing at the edges of her mind. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The shadows seemed to part for it, as if it were both a part of the curse and the one who had created it. And as it approached, Evelyn could hear its voice, low, deep, and like the rumble of thunder. "You think you control the curse, child?" The voice was both terrifying and oddly comforting, as if it had always been there, waiting for her. "You are not its master. You are merely its vessel. You always have been." Evelyn recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest. The power radiating from the figure was suffocating, but she couldn't run. She couldn't escape. This was why the curse had come to her. This was what it had been waiting for. She gasped, shaking her head. "I'm not your vessel. I won't be used like that." The figure's head tilted slightly, and Evelyn could feel the dark energy seeping into her, curling around her thoughts, threatening to smother her resolve. The whispers grew louder, the voice in her head urging her to give in, to let the curse take control. "You cannot fight what you are," the figure said, its voice colder now, more insistent. "The darkness is within you. It always has been." Evelyn's vision blurred, the curse pulling at her, trying to drown her in its power. She was losing control. She could feel herself slipping, the darkness creeping into every corner of her being, wrapping around her heart, threatening to snuff out the last shred of her humanity. But in that moment, as the shadows closed in on her, Evelyn found a spark of resistance deep inside her. It was faint, fragile, but it was enough. She remembered the words she had told herself earlier. "I will not be a prisoner." She closed her eyes and focused, pulling every ounce of strength she had left. The curse was powerful, yes, but it wasn't her. She was the one who had learned to wield it, and now she would use it against whatever was standing before her. With a sudden, sharp cry, Evelyn extended her hand toward the figure, channeling all the energy of the curse into it. The shadows recoiled, the air snapping with power as the ground beneath her feet cracked open, sending shards of stone and earth flying. The figure's eyes gleamed from beneath its hood, but it didn't move. It only watched her, as if it were curious to see how far she would go. Evelyn's heart raced, the power within her raging like a storm. "I am not your servant," she spat, her voice trembling but fierce. "And I will never be anyone's puppet." And with that, she released everything. The curse, the darkness, all of it. It surged forward in a wave of pure, unrelenting power. The figure staggered back, the shadows around it writhing and snapping as if in pain. The air shimmered with raw, untamed magic, and Evelyn felt something inside her break free. The curse had always been a part of her, but now she realized she had become it, and nothing would ever be the same again. The forest, the altar, the figure, all of it faded into nothingness. The world around her shifted, and Evelyn was left standing in the clearing, alone, with only the echoes of her triumph and the hum of the curse within her. The power was hers, and now Evelyn knew one thing for certain. It would never control her again. Evelyn stood in the stillness, her chest heaving as the final tremors of power dissipated into the night. The forest, once so heavy with ominous energy, now felt eerily quiet, almost serene. The figure, the altar, the presence that had tried to claim her were gone. She had banished them, but the silence felt almost too still, as if the world were waiting, holding its breath. The curse inside her thrummed softly, no longer an overwhelming storm, but a steady current beneath her skin. She wasn't entirely free from its pull, but she had redefined the relationship between them. She could feel its presence, a constant companion now, but she had learned how to wield it, how to become it without being consumed. But even as she stood there, feeling the weight of her power settle into a new rhythm, doubts lingered in the corners of her mind. The figure's words echoed in her ears. "You are merely its vessel." Had she truly won? Or was she still just a puppet, held by invisible strings? The wind stirred again, gentle but persistent, brushing past her skin like a whisper. The trees above swayed, their leaves rustling as if they shared some ancient secret. The curse, or what remained of it, had not gone away, and she knew that her victory over the figure had not erased the darkness within her. But she had proven something to herself. She had claimed her power. Still, there was a lingering sense that this was only the beginning. Evelyn began walking, her feet brushing against the soft earth, following a path that felt drawn out for her. as if the forest was guiding her, or perhaps testing her. The trees seemed to shift and twist as she moved forward, their trunks curving like watching eyes. The air was thick with magic, heavy with an ancient energy that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. A distant noise reached her ears, a crackling sound, sharp like a twig snapping in the dark. It came from somewhere beyond the trees. Evelyn's hand instinctively moved toward the dagger she had taken from the figure earlier, though she didn't feel like she needed it. She had become something far more dangerous than any weapon. As she moved toward the source of the noise, the clearing ahead revealed itself, a broken, ancient structure half swallowed by the forest. Old stone ruins, long abandoned by time, stood like a silent monument to whatever ancient power had once ruled here. Vines crept over the walls, twisting into the cracks and crumbling foundations, hiding something in the shadows. It was here. Evelyn could feel it. The same dark energy she had felt earlier, the thing that had whispered to her. The presence that had tried to claim her and turn her into its puppet. But now it felt different. Less like a force she was running from, and more like a challenge she was stepping up to face head on. She walked toward the ruins, each step deliberate, echoing in the stillness of the night. The air grew colder as she approached, and the vines that clung to the stones seemed to shift as if they recognized her. The wind whispered more urgently now, as if urging her to understand something, to see what had been hidden for so long. At the center of the ruins, the ground sloped down into a deep, circular pit. The air around it shimmered with magic, thick and oppressive. Evelyn felt drawn to it, as if something inside her, the curse, the force she had accepted as part of her, was telling her that this was where her journey would continue. Looking down into the pit, she saw the faintest glow at the bottom. It was faint, but it pulsed in rhythm with her heart, like the slow beat of a drum echoing in the dark. Something ancient and powerful was waiting there. She could feel it. "What are you?" she whispered to the darkness below, her voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. A slow, hollow laugh echoed from the depths of the pit, as if the very earth was laughing at her. The sound was deep, hollow, and filled with a malevolent joy. Evelyn recoiled, but the curse inside her surged with energy, demanding her to answer, to move forward, to claim her power once and for all. She said, her voice unwavering, louder this time, "I'm not afraid of you." The laugh died abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. The glow at the bottom of the pit intensified, then suddenly burst forth like a wave of pure energy. Evelyn staggered back, raising her hands instinctively to shield herself, but the magic didn't hurt. It flowed through her, surrounding her, filling every cell in her body with its cold, unyielding power. And then she understood. The curse had never been just a weapon or a force of destruction. It was an ancient energy that had existed long before her, long before the figure or the altar. The figure had been just a gatekeeper, a false prophet, trying to control something that could never be controlled. The power she had absorbed, this dark force, was part of the world's very foundation. It had been waiting for her, choosing her as its vessel because she was the one who could hold it, who could wield it, and shape it into something greater. For the first time, Evelyn saw the full picture. The curse had always been connected to this place, to the ruins beneath her feet, to the very earth that pulsed with magic. She wasn't just the keeper of the curse. She was the link between the ancient forces that had shaped the world and the present. She was the one who could wield both the light and the darkness, the guardian of balance, a force of nature herself. But she could not deny the truth any longer. This power would always hunger for more. Her breath caught in her throat as a new realization settled over her. She wasn't the only one who had been waiting for the curse to find its keeper. There were others, hidden forces, ancient entities that had known of this moment long before she had ever stepped foot into the forest. She had been drawn here for a reason, and now She could feel their presence all around her, watching her every move. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, and she stepped back, looking around as the shadows of the trees grew darker, more insistent. There was no turning back now. The power inside her had already begun to change the world, and the ancient forces would either see her as their champion or their downfall. Her pulse quickened, the wind howling around her, the curse surging beneath her skin. Evelyn stood at the edge of the pit, looking down into the glowing depths where the ancient power awaited. It would either make her or break her, and she was ready for whatever came next. As the night stretched on, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act. The curse had found its keeper. Now, Evelyn would face her true trial, and she would never be the same again. The energy in the air thickened, swirling around Evelyn like a storm waiting to break. The ancient power in the pit pulsed rhythmically, as if it were alive, aware of her presence, testing her resolve. Every breath she took felt charged with electric anticipation, her skin alive with the hum of the curse that had now fully settled within her. She was both part of the world and apart from it, bound to something far older than anything she had ever understood. The shadows in the forest deepened further, and the wind began to howl with more urgency, as though something was stirring in the darkness around her. She could feel it, watching, waiting. Something ancient, something that had slumbered for eons, now waking. And she, Evelyn, stood at the center of it all, the keeper of the curse, the keeper of the balance. A voice, hollow, distant, but unmistakably clear, rang out from the depths of the pit. "You are the one," it whispered, reverberating through her bones. The sound was low, guttural, as if it were emanating from the very earth itself. The keeper, the cursed, the broken. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, but she remained still, focusing on her breathing, grounding herself in the knowledge that this was not the first time she had faced something that wished to dominate her. She had already chosen to face the darkness. Now, she had to see where it would take her. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear that was creeping into her chest. "What is this? What is your purpose?" The voice only laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine, reverberating through the very air she breathed. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of something far more ancient, a laugh of recognition, of understanding, of inevitability. "Purpose? My purpose, mortal, is to unmake the world you know. I am the beginning. I am the end. You, Evelyn, are the key. You are what will decide if this world will survive, or if it will burn." The words struck her like a physical blow. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind reeling. Was this really what she had become part of? A force of destruction, capable of unmaking the very fabric of the world? But something within her, something dark, something powerful, pushed her forward, urging her not to back down. No, she would not let it end like this. She had chosen this path, and there was no going back. But she would not let this power consume her. She would use it to reshape the world, not destroy it. The air shimmered around her as the voice continued to echo through the pit, now growing louder, more insistent, almost as if the force behind it was becoming desperate. "You cannot contain me forever. I will rise, and I will take back what was mine. You will be my vessel, and the curse will break you. It always breaks those who think they can control it." The ground beneath her feet cracked, as if the very earth was trembling in fear or anticipation. Evelyn felt the dark powers surge within her, fighting for dominance, twisting through her veins like a living thing. Her vision blurred as the force threatened to overtake her, but she fought against it, pushing the energy back, refusing to let it define her. "I won't be your vessel," she muttered through gritted teeth, forcing herself to remain grounded, despite the immense pressure building within her. "I will control it. I will control you." For a moment, there was silence. The wind died down, and the trees stilled, as if holding their breath. Then, the energy around her shifted, the darkness pulling back slightly, as if testing her resolve. The force in the pit pulsed again, more intensely now, like a heartbeat growing stronger. "Then prove it," the voice whispered, its tone now laced with an eerie calm. "Prove you are strong enough to wield the power you claim. Prove you can become what you think you are." Evelyn's breath caught. The challenge hung in the air, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The curse that had once been a weapon, a dark force pulling at her very soul, was now both her burden and her strength. But she couldn't let it define her. She couldn't let it be the only thing that guided her. The glow from the pit intensified, radiating with a fierce brilliance, but Evelyn wasn't afraid. She wasn't the terrified girl who had stumbled into the forest anymore. She was the keeper. She was the curse itself, no longer just a victim of it. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, placing her hand once again on the stone surface of the ancient altar, feeling the pulse of the power beneath her fingertips. The air grew thicker, colder, as if the world itself was bracing for what was about to happen. She closed her eyes and focused, reaching deep within herself to where the darkness lay. It was part of her now, part of the fabric of her soul. The hunger, the anger, the power, they all flowed through her, but she could control it. She had to control it. She was not its servant. She was its equal. The wind howled again, whipping around her, and with a surge of will, Evelyn called the darkness to her. It rose from the depths of the pit, swirling around her, but this time, she led it, guiding it, bending it to her will. The forest trembled as the power surged through her, rushing to answer her call. A brilliant, blinding light flared from the pit, the energy erupting in a final, explosive burst. Evelyn was swept up in it, her body surrounded by an all-consuming, overwhelming force. She felt herself fall deeper into the abyss, her mind racing with the knowledge that this was the moment. This was the test. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She embraced the darkness. The world around her seemed to crumble and shift, the very fabric of reality bending to her will. The curse twisted and turned, but she held it, pulled it into herself, contained it. The shadows roared, furious at being bound, but Evelyn held tight, her hands glowing with the intensity of the power she had just claimed. And then the light flickered. The pit's energy began to fade, its glow dimming as Evelyn's control solidified. The force in the pit struggled, but it was her now, just as she was its. The ancient voice whispered one last time, faint and distant. "So, it is done. You are the keeper. The curse is yours." Evelyn opened her eyes, her gaze sharp, her heart steady. The force that had once threatened to consume her now lay at her feet, contained within her own will. She had passed the trial. She had become what the curse could never make her, a true master of it. And as the night stretched on, Evelyn knew one thing for sure. The world was changing, and she would be the one to shape its future. The curse was no longer a force of destruction. It was now her weapon, her gift, her power. And it would bend to her will, just as everything else would. The air felt still now, as though the forest had exhaled after holding its breath for so long. Evelyn stood alone in the clearing, her hands still resting on the altar, her body humming with a power unlike anything she had ever felt before. The darkness that had once terrified her, the curse that had haunted her every step, was now an extension of her will, a tool, not a torment. But the quiet that followed the storm left an unsettling weight in its place. She felt the world shifting beneath her feet, as though the land itself was waiting for her next move. The trees that had once seemed to watch her every step now stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and stretching in the dim light of the moon. The forest was no longer the labyrinth it had been, the way forward now clear, though still uncertain. Evelyn's mind raced with the realization of what she had just done. She had claimed the power within her, but she had also opened a door, one that could never be closed. The curse had not just altered her, it had bound her to something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She could feel it deep within her, the pull of forces she could not yet comprehend, waiting for the moment to reveal themselves in their entirety. She looked down at her hands, feeling the energy crackling beneath her skin, hot and cold at once, as if the very blood running through her veins had changed. She had been marked by something ancient, something primal. It was a power that could either save the world or tear it apart. The weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. "What now?" she whispered aloud, as though the trees or the night itself might answer her question. The wind picked up again, a soft murmur running through the branches. She turned toward the path that stretched out before her, the way forward now apparent. But what lay ahead? Was this truly the beginning of her reign over the curse? Or had she only taken the first step toward a greater, more terrifying journey? Before she could contemplate any further, a soft rustling from the edge of the clearing broke her thoughts. Her pulse quickened, and the curse surged in response, as if readying itself for whatever came next. Through the trees, a figure stepped into the clearing, tall, with dark, hooded robes that billowed like smoke in the moonlight. Evelyn's hand instinctively went to the dagger at her side, but she didn't need to draw it. The figure was not a threat. At least, not in the way she expected. "You have done it," the figure spoke, its voice deep and gravelly, yet unmistakably calm. "You have claimed the power. You are the keeper now." Evelyn stiffened. "Who are you?" Her voice was low but steady, every muscle in her body tensed and ready for a fight. The figure stepped forward, lifting the hood of its robe to reveal a face she could never forget. It was a face from her past, a face she had seen in fleeting dreams, in visions that now felt like memories long buried. It was an older version of herself, haunted eyes, weathered skin, a distant sadness clouding her expression. She gasped, taking a step back, her heart pounding. "You're me, aren't you?" The figure nodded solemnly. "Yes, or rather I was you, once." It paused, its eyes locking onto Evelyn's with a knowing gaze, a gaze that spoke of years of knowledge, of power, and of an irreversible path that Evelyn was now walking. "I was the one who tried to control the curse, to wield it, but I couldn't. I was too weak to face what came after." Evelyn felt a cold chill settle in her chest. "You failed?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You couldn't control it?" "No," the figure said, a trace of regret in its voice. "I tried, but there are forces beyond us, forces that hunger for more than we can offer. I thought I could master the curse, but I was wrong. It consumed me. It shattered everything I believed in. And now here I am. A warning." Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was what she feared most, becoming something she didn't understand. The figure before her, the echo of her future self, was proof that the curse could break even the strongest. The power she had just claimed was a double-edged sword, one that could easily cut her down if she wasn't careful. "Then what happens now?" Evelyn asked, her voice firmer now, though the weight of her fears still pressed heavily on her chest. "What do I do?" The figure's eyes softened, almost sympathetically. "That's the question, isn't it?" It stepped closer, its gaze fixed on Evelyn, almost as if assessing her. "You think you've mastered the curse, but I can tell you this, you are not free. No one who touches that power ever truly is. The world is already starting to shift, and there will be others who will want to use your power to control you. Some may seek to destroy you, while others will try to manipulate you. The curse is an ancient force, but it is not the only one that exists in this world." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. She had known there were dangers, but this was something deeper, more pervasive. "What do you mean?" she asked. "What is coming for me?" The figure paused, then slowly lowered its head, as though unwilling to speak the words aloud. Finally, it spoke in a tone that sent a shiver of dread through Evelyn. "There are others, other keepers of ancient forces. They know about you. They will come for you, Evelyn. They will come for the curse, for your power." Evelyn felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. "What do I do? How do I stop them?" The figure's gaze sharpened. You don't. You can't. You only have one choice left. Accept your fate and prepare to fight. The world has already been set in motion, and now you must decide how far you are willing to go to survive, to protect what is yours. It stepped back, its robes swirling like smoke, as though it were preparing to leave. But remember this, Evelyn, the figure said, its voice now a distant echo. The curse will always be a part of you. You will always have to face it. But you're stronger than I ever was. You may just be the one who can make it work, for better or worse. With that, the figure turned and faded into the shadows, vanishing as though it had never been there at all. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, processing the words, the warning. She felt the weight of her power shift within her once more, now laced with uncertainty. The curse had always been hers to wield, but now there were others involved, others who would try to claim her, to claim the very force that lived inside her. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. She had faced darkness before, and she would do it again. Whatever came next, she would fight. She had to. She had no other choice. The forest around her whispered, alive with secrets and unseen forces. The path ahead would not be easy. It never was. But Evelyn had learned long ago that there was power in survival. And now, she would do more than survive. She would shape her own destiny. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She had spent too long running, too long fearing the power within her. Now, with the knowledge that others were coming, she had no choice but to stand her ground. She turned away from the now silent altar and stepped forward, leaving the clearing behind. The air had shifted, and she could feel it, something beyond the trees, beyond the land itself, stirring in the distance. The figure's warning echoed in her mind. The others will come for you. Fine, let them come. The first of them arrived at dawn. The sky had barely begun to lighten when she heard the whispers, low, indecipherable voices curling through the trees like smoke. Evelyn stood in the center of an abandoned village, long since claimed by decay, the remnants of forgotten lives scattered around her like ghosts of the past. Then, the figures emerged from a mist. There were 3 of them, clad in dark robes similar to the vision of her future self. But these were no mere echoes of possibility. They were real. Their eyes gleamed with something ancient, something hungry. Keeper, the tallest one said, stepping forward. His voice was deep, cold, and absolute. You have something that does not belong to you. Evelyn tilted her head, her fingers curling at her sides. No, she said simply. It belongs to me now. The figure smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You think you understand what you've taken. You don't. The curse was never meant for you. It is an old power, one that should have remained buried. Evelyn felt the darkness within her coil, ready. And yet here I am. The second figure, a woman with silver hair and piercing violet eyes, stepped forward. We don't have to fight you, Evelyn. You can still surrender it. Give up the power, and we will let you walk away. Evelyn laughed softly. You think I don't know what happens if I do? I've seen what your kind does. You don't want to contain this power. You want to use it. The third figure, silent until now, sighed. So be it. Then they attacked. The battle was unlike anything Evelyn had ever experienced. These were not ordinary people. They were wielders of forgotten magic, beings who had spent lifetimes honing their power. Shadows twisted at their command. The earth cracked beneath their feet, and the very air seemed to bend to their will. But Evelyn was no longer a frightened girl lost in the woods. She was the curse. She moved within human speed, dodging tendrils of darkness that lashed toward her. She raised a hand, and the very force they sought to claim erupted from her palm, sending 2 of them crashing backward. The tallest of them held his ground, his gaze sharp with realization. You're stronger than I expected, he admitted. Evelyn didn't give him time to say more. She lunged, the curse burning through her veins like fire. Her hands closed around his throat, and for the first time, she felt something new, control. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was leading. The man gasped as the curse surged from her hands into his body, tendrils of darkness wrapping around him. binding him in place. The other two tried to intervene, but Evelyn sent a pulse of raw power outward, knocking them to the ground. She could feel it now, the balance shifting, the ancient forces bending to her will. For so long, she had feared that the curse would consume her. But now she saw the truth. It was never about resisting it. It was about commanding it. The man in her grasp struggled, his eyes flickering with something close to fear. "You don't understand what you're doing," he choked out. Evelyn's grip tightened. "Yes," she said, "I do." And with a final surge of power, she let the darkness take him. By the time the battle ended, the village was silent once more. The figures lay at her feet, motionless, their bodies untouched, but their life forces utterly drained. The curse had taken what it needed, leaving behind only echoes. Evelyn stood among the ruins, the morning sun rising behind her. She was breathing hard, her body aching, but she was still standing. She had won, and yet she knew this was only the beginning. The others would come. They would always come, but they would not find a girl struggling against her fate. They would find her, the keeper, the master of the curse, and she would be ready. As the sun climbed higher, Evelyn turned away from the battlefield and stepped forward, disappearing into the new day. The world belonged to her now, and she would shape it as she saw fit.